Tonight, we enter a place that was never meant to be remembered, not because it was hidden, but because it was designed to leave nothing behind. In a quiet forest in occupied Poland, trains arrived daily. The doors opened. People stepped out, believing they were being resettled. Within hours, almost all of them were gone. No barracks for long-term imprisonment. No labor system meant to sustain life. Only speed, deception, and silence. This was Treblinka, a place built not to control people, but to erase them. More than 800,000 men, women, and children were murdered here in just over a year. And then, the camp itself was dismantled, buildings destroyed, bodies burned, the ground plowed, as if it had never existed. Tonight, we reconstruct what the Nazis tried to erase. We will trace how Treblinka was built, how it operated, how prisoners resisted, and how memory survived a place designed to leave no witnesses. Before we begin, take a moment, comment, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you value calm, respectful historical documentaries like this, hit the subscribe button so these stories are never forgotten. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Blueprint of Extermination. Treblinka did not emerge from chaos or improvisation. It was the result of planning, cold, deliberate, and systematic. By 1941, Nazi leadership had already moved beyond persecution and ghettoization. What followed was a shift toward complete annihilation, carried out under a secret program known as Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard was named after Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. Its goal was clear: the physical extermination of the Jewish population in occupied Poland. To accomplish this, the Nazis would construct three primary death camps: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, each designed for efficiency rather than detention. Treblinka was chosen for its isolation and accessibility. Located northeast of Warsaw, near an existing railway line, it sat close enough to major Jewish population centers to allow rapid deportations, yet far enough from large towns to conceal what was happening. The surrounding forest acted as both camouflage and barrier, shielding the camp from witnesses. Construction began in early 1942. Unlike concentration camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka was not built for labor or long-term confinement. Its layout reflected a singular purpose. From the moment prisoners arrived, every structure guided them toward death. There were no sprawling barracks, no factories, no attempt to sustain life beyond a few hours or days. The camp was divided into two main sections. The lower camp, known as Treblinka II, functioned as a forced labor camp for non-Jewish prisoners. But the true center of extermination was Treblinka II. This area was sealed off, inaccessible to outsiders, and tightly controlled by SS personnel and a small number of guards recruited from occupied territories. At the heart of Treblinka II lay the killing facilities. Victims were led through a narrow, fenced pathway, cynically referred to as the road to heaven. Disguised as a corridor leading to showers, it was bordered by branches and wire to prevent escape or observation. Every design choice served deception. The Nazis understood that resistance was less likely if victims believed they were being relocated. Signs pointed toward bathhouses. Orders were given calmly. Guards spoke of work assignments and hygiene. This psychological manipulation allowed the camp to function with terrifying speed. Few prisoners remained alive long enough to understand where they were. Those who did were selected for forced labor, sorting belongings, cutting hair, removing bodies. These prisoners lived under constant threat of execution, aware that survival was temporary. From the beginning, Treblinka was not meant to endure. Unlike camps intended to last years, this one was built to complete its task quickly and then vanish. The Nazis planned not only mass murder, but also the erasure of evidence. By the summer of 1942, trains were arriving daily. Entire communities were disappearing, and the machinery of death was operating exactly as designed. In the next segment, we will follow those trains from ghettos to the forest and examine how deportations fed Treblinka at a scale that defies comprehension. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The trains that fed the camp. The existence of Treblinka depended entirely on movement. Not movement of armies or supplies, but of people. Entire families transported with ruthless efficiency from their homes to a place they were never meant to leave. The camp itself could not function without the railway system that fed it daily, silently transforming cities into emptiness. By mid-1942, deportations accelerated dramatically. Orders were issued across occupied Poland, especially in areas with large Jewish populations. The largest source was Warsaw, where more than 400,000 Jews had been confined inside a sealed ghetto. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding had already weakened the population. Treblinka would finish what the ghetto had begun. Deportation notices were often delivered with minimal warning. Sometimes families were told to prepare for resettlement in the East. Other times, roundups occurred without explanation. People were ordered to gather with limited belongings, a suitcase, food for a few days, documents. Many believed they were being sent to labor camps. Some hoped relocation might mean survival. The journey began at local collection points, streets filled with fear and confusion. Elderly people struggled to walk. Children clutched parents. Those who resisted were beaten or shot. The process was public, meant to demonstrate absolute control. Once gathered, deportees were marched or transported to railway stations under armed guard. The trains themselves were freight cars, not designed for human transport. Wooden wagons intended for cattle were packed beyond capacity. Dozens, sometimes more than 100 people, were forced into each car. The doors were sealed from the outside. Air was scarce. Water was rarely provided. Sanitation was non-existent. Journeys could last hours or days, depending on distance and delays. Inside the cars, conditions deteriorated rapidly. People fainted. Children cried until their voices failed. The sick and elderly often died before the train reached its destination. Bodies remained upright, pressed against the living, because there was no space to fall. For those inside, time lost meaning. Darkness, heat, and panic created a state of disorientation. Some tried to comfort others. Some prayed. Some screamed. Some fell silent. Few could imagine that the journey itself was only the beginning of what awaited them. As trains approached Treblinka, there were no signs announcing the camp's purpose. The station was small, almost ordinary. Surrounded by forest, it looked like a rural stop rather than a site of mass murder. This was intentional. Deception did not end at the camp gates. Upon arrival, guards shouted orders. Whistles blew. Dogs barked. The doors were forced open, releasing heat, stench, and shock. Survivors later described this moment as a violent rupture. Light flooding darkness, screams colliding with commands, bodies collapsing onto the platform. Those who could not move quickly were beaten or shot. The dead were dragged aside. Families were pushed forward, barely given time to understand where they were. SS officers and guards maintained a rehearsed routine designed to keep chaos under control. Victims were told they had arrived at a transit camp. They were instructed to leave their belongings behind for disinfection. Valuables were to be surrendered for safekeeping. Calm voices assured them that showers awaited, after which work assignments would be given. Signs reinforced the lie. Buildings resembled bathhouses. The environment was staged to reduce panic. Even the presence of Jewish prisoners working in the camp was used to lend credibility. Victims assumed these individuals were proof that survival was possible. What most did not realize was that almost no one who arrived that day would be alive by nightfall. The trains kept coming. Sometimes multiple transports arrived in a single day. The camp's capacity was stretched beyond design, leading to moments of horrific congestion. Thousands waiting in holding areas, confused and terrified, while the machinery of death struggled to keep pace. Railway schedules were adjusted to maximize efficiency. Deportations became routine. Conductors, guards, administrators all played roles in a process that transformed genocide into logistics. The system relied not only on ideology, but on coordination. For the Nazis, the success of Treblinka was measured in numbers moved and numbers erased. The railway was not a neutral tool. It was a weapon, one that allowed killing to occur far from public view, with bureaucratic precision. In the next segment, we will step inside the camp itself and follow what happened after the platform. The final hours experienced by those who arrived believing they might still survive. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Arrival, Deception, and the Final Hours. What happened after the train doors opened at Treblinka unfolded with terrifying speed. The camp was designed so that confusion replaced comprehension and urgency replaced thought. From the very first moments on the platform, every movement was controlled, every second directed toward a single outcome. As deportees were forced from the rail cars, they entered an environment engineered to appear temporary and orderly. SS officers and guards shouted instructions with practiced authority. Victims were told they had arrived at a transit camp. They were informed that before continuing onward, they would need to bathe and have their clothes disinfected. The language was deliberate. Nothing suggested permanence. Nothing suggested death. Men and women were separated almost immediately. Families were torn apart in seconds. Mothers clutched children until guards forced them apart. Elderly parents were pushed one direction while adult children were driven another. There was rarely time for goodbye. Many believed the separation was temporary, part of a processing procedure they would reunite from later. Those deemed too weak to walk, the sick, the disabled, the very old, were often taken aside. Some were told they would be transported to an infirmary. Instead, many were taken directly to execution sites and killed by gunshot. Their bodies were removed quickly, hidden from view, so that the illusion could continue uninterrupted. The remaining prisoners were ordered into undressing barracks. They were instructed to remember where they placed their shoes. They were told to tie them together neatly. Signs on the walls reinforced the narrative of hygiene and relocation. Guards sometimes joked. The casual tone deepened the deception. People complied because resistance seemed irrational. The environment offered no clear explanation of danger. For many, the hope of survival, however fragile, was stronger than suspicion. Panic was discouraged through force, but also through normality. Once undressed, victims were driven forward along a narrow fenced corridor known by survivors as the tube. It was lined with branches and wire, blocking sight lines and preventing escape. The path curved gently, ensuring that the final destination could not be seen until it was too late. At the end of the corridor stood the gas chambers. From the outside, they resembled communal shower buildings. Pipes ran along the ceiling. Doors were marked with symbols suggesting sanitation. Everything about the structure reinforced the lie. Inside, victims were packed tightly. Guards urged them to make room, to step closer together. Claiming space was limited. The doors were sealed. Within minutes, engine exhaust was pumped into the chamber. Carbon monoxide filled the room. Panic erupted, then suffocation. The process lasted long enough to ensure death, but not long enough to allow escape. Those forced to work inside Treblinka, the Sonderkommando, were made to remove bodies after each gassing. They cut hair, extracted gold teeth, and transported corpses to burial pits or later to cremation sites. These prisoners lived under constant threat, knowing they would eventually be killed and replaced. The pace was relentless. Transports arrived, chambers filled, bodies were removed, belongings were sorted. The cycle repeated again and again, sometimes without pause for days. The camp was designed so that most victims never understood what was happening until the final moments. Knowledge was dangerous, not for the prisoners but for the system. Deception reduced resistance. Speed reduced chaos. Fear was controlled, not unleashed. By nightfall, almost everyone who had arrived that day was dead. Smoke drifted above the trees. The forest absorbed the sound. Nearby villages continued their routines, some aware, some uncertain, many afraid to ask questions. Treblinka existed in a space of enforced invisibility, known but unspoken. What remains most chilling is not only the scale of murder, but the precision with which it was executed. This was not spontaneous violence. It was structured annihilation, repeated daily, carried out by ordinary systems made extraordinary through ideology. In the next chapter, we will turn away from the machinery and look instead at the people trapped within it, the prisoners forced to labor, to witness, and to survive inside a place built to destroy every trace of life. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Life inside a place designed for death. Treblinka was not meant to sustain life, yet life existed there, fragile, temporary, and constantly under threat. The people who remained alive inside the camp after arrival did so only because the machinery of death required witnesses, workers, and bodies to keep itself running. Survival inside Treblinka was never accidental, and it was never secure. Those selected for labor were usually young, physically strong, and able to follow orders quickly. Selection was arbitrary and brutal. A gesture from an SS officer, a moment of hesitation, a visible illness. Any of these could mean immediate death. Those spared execution were not spared suffering. They entered a different kind of prison, one without hope of release. Forced labor prisoners were divided into work units. Some were assigned to unload trains. Others sorted clothing and possessions. Some were made to cut hair from women moments before death. Others were tasked with removing bodies from the gas chambers. Every role carried psychological devastation layered atop physical exhaustion. The sorting area became a landscape of stolen lives. Mountains of shoes, coats, glasses, prayer books, toys, and suitcases filled the barracks. Each item represented a person who had arrived believing they might live. Prisoners were ordered to categorize, stack, and prepare belongings for transport back to Germany. Even in death, victims were exploited. Food inside Treblinka was scarce and deliberately inadequate. Prisoners survived on watery soup and scraps. Hunger weakened bodies already traumatized by terror and loss. Disease spread easily. Injuries went untreated. Medical care existed only to preserve labor value for a few more days or weeks. Punishment was constant and unpredictable. Guards beat prisoners for minor infractions or no reason at all. Public executions were used to enforce obedience. Prisoners were forced to witness the deaths of others as a warning. Terror was not a side effect of camp life. It was a management tool. Despite this, relationships formed. Prisoners whispered names. They shared crumbs of food. They exchanged fragments of memory about families, hometowns, and lives before the camp. These moments of human connection were acts of resistance, however small. Time inside Treblinka moved strangely. Days blended together, marked not by clocks, but by transports and killings. The arrival of trains meant long hours of labor and fresh waves of horror. Nights offered no rest. only the exhaustion that came from surviving another day. The Sonderkommando lived with a particularly heavy burden. They knew the truth of Treblinka's purpose. They saw death up close, touched it, carried it, disposed of it. The psychological toll was immense. Many suffered breakdowns. Some begged for death. Others held onto the faintest hope of revolt. The Nazis intended that no one who understood Treblinka would survive. Forced labor prisoners were routinely executed and replaced to eliminate witnesses. Survival meant knowing that one's life had an expiration date. Yet even under these conditions, people observed, remembered, and recorded what they could. Some memorized names of SS officers. Some counted transports. Some mentally mapped the camp layout. Information became a form of defiance. Faith did not disappear entirely. Some prayed silently. Others rejected belief altogether, unable to reconcile it with what they saw. Both responses were human. The camp allowed no space for certainty, only endurance. Music, strangely, also existed. On occasion, guards forced prisoners to sing or play instruments to mask the sounds of killing. What was meant as humiliation sometimes became a lifeline, a reminder of humanity amid dehumanization. The forest surrounding Treblinka served as a cruel contrast. Trees grew. Buissons. Seasons changed. Inside the camp, time stood still in perpetual terror. Prisoners later recalled the pain of noticing beauty where none should exist. Treblinka did not rely solely on physical barriers. It relied on psychological collapse. Exhaustion, fear, hunger, and isolation worked together to break resistance. And yet, resistance did not vanish. Small acts mattered. A shared warning, a delayed command, a hidden tool, a glance that communicated truth without words. Survival inside Treblinka was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, fragile, and deeply human. In the next segment, we will examine how prisoners moved from endurance to defiance, how whispered knowledge became planning, and how the impossible idea of resistance began to take shape inside a place built to erase every trace of will. Chapter 2, Segment 2, From Endurance to Resistance. The birth of defiance inside Treblinka. Resistance inside Treblinka did not begin with weapons or plans. It began with awareness, with the slow, painful realization that survival through obedience was an illusion and that every prisoner, no matter how useful, was marked for death. This understanding spread quietly, carried in glances, whispered warnings, and a shared knowledge of those who had seen too much to believe in escape through compliance. For months, prisoners endured with the faint hope that the war might end before the camp ended them. But as transports continued uninterrupted, as execution squads rotated labor units to erase witnesses, and as rumors from the outside world vanished entirely, that hope collapsed. What replaced it was something more dangerous to the Nazis: clarity. The men who worked closest to the machinery of death understood first. Members of the Sonderkommando saw the cycle repeat endlessly: arrival, deception, murder, disposal, replacement. They knew the camp was not temporary. It was permanent annihilation. Their survival depended not on obedience, but on timing. Discussions of resistance were dangerous. Any hint of conspiracy meant instant execution. Guards relied heavily on informants, often coercing prisoners into betraying one another. Trust was rare and earned slowly. Conversations happened while working, masked by noise. Plans were spoken in fragments, never fully assembled in one place. Leadership emerged organically. Prisoners with military backgrounds, engineers, carpenters, and those who had access to tools became central figures. Knowledge mattered more than strength. A man who knew where keys were kept, how locks worked, or how schedules shifted held power that no weapon could match. The first step was observation. Prisoners memorized guard routines. They noted which SS officers drank heavily, which were careless, which relied most on Ukrainian guards. They tracked weapon storage locations. They counted shifts. They studied the armory, the fuel depot, the gates. Weapons were nearly impossible to obtain. Firearms were locked away, guarded constantly. But tools existed: axes, knives, shovels, crowbars. In Treblinka, even a hammer could become an instrument of revolt. Smuggling these items required extraordinary risk. Tools disappeared slowly, one at a time, hidden under clothing or buried in the ground. One of the greatest challenges was unity. Treblinka housed prisoners from many regions, speaking different languages, holding different beliefs. Some feared retaliation against fellow prisoners. Others doubted success. Convincing men already broken by trauma to embrace a plan that would likely end in death was no small task. What pushed the movement forward was certainty. Prisoners began to understand that the Nazis intended to liquidate Treblinka entirely once its purpose was fulfilled. Evidence mounted: fewer transports, increased executions of labor units, destruction of records. The camp was preparing to erase itself. If they waited, they would vanish with it. The idea of uprising was not romantic. No one believed they could defeat the camp. The goal was chaos, confusion long enough for some to escape. Even a handful of survivors would be a victory. Witnesses mattered. Memory mattered. Coordination intensified in secret. Roles were assigned carefully. So would attack guards. Others would set buildings on fire. A group would rush the armory. Another would cut communication lines. Every action depended on timing down to minutes. Silence became a discipline. Prisoners trained themselves not to react, not to stare, not to signal. Fear had to be managed internally. Panic could doom everyone. Trust was extended cautiously, often without words. The psychological weight was immense. Men preparing to revolt knew they might be killing for the first time, not as executioners forced by the Nazis, but as agents of their own will. This distinction mattered deeply. It transformed despair into purpose. There were moments of doubt. Rumors of informants caused temporary freezes. Small mistakes nearly exposed the plan more than once. Yet the movement endured, held together by the shared understanding that inaction guaranteed death. As the planned day approached, prisoners prepared themselves mentally. Some prayed. Some said goodbye silently to friends. Some etched names into memory, knowing there would be no written record. They did not know how many would survive. They only knew that Treblinka would not consume them quietly. In the next segment, we will witness the uprising itself, the moment when secrecy shattered, flames rose, and prisoners forced the world to confront a place the Nazis meant to leave no trace behind. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Fire, gunshots, and the breaking of the camp. The Treblinka uprising. The uprising at Treblinka did not begin with a shout or a rallying cry. It began quietly, like everything else in the camp. A stolen key, a door unlocked at the wrong moment, a guard who did not realize that history was about to turn against him. It was August 2nd, 1943. The heat was heavy, the air thick with dust and the smell of burning waste. Most of the SS officers were away, swimming in the Bug River, leaving the camp under reduced supervision. The prisoners had waited for this exact moment. They had memorized the schedule. They knew which men were gone, which guards remained, and how much time they might have before reinforcements arrived. The plan was already in motion before the first act of violence occurred. Inside the camp, a small group of prisoners moved toward the armory. Using keys stolen weeks earlier, they unlocked the building that held rifles, pistols, and grenades. The weapons were distributed quickly, silently, hands shaking but determined. There were not enough guns for everyone. There never would be. Many men would go into the uprising armed only with tools, knives, or nothing at all. The first shots rang out suddenly, shattering the fragile illusion of control that had ruled Treblinka. A Ukrainian guard fell. Another was struck with an axe. Flames erupted almost immediately as prisoners set fire to fuel stores, barracks, and administrative buildings. Thick black smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles, announcing to the surrounding countryside that Treblinka was burning. Panic spread through the camp. Guards ran in confusion, unsure where the attack was coming from or how many prisoners were involved. Some fled. Others fired wildly into the crowd. SS officers who returned from the river rushed back, shouting orders that no one could properly follow. The carefully maintained system of terror collapsed into chaos. Prisoners surged toward the fences. The camp's perimeter was lined with barbed wire, some of it electrified, some of it reinforced with branches and camouflage to conceal it from view. Men threw themselves against it anyway. Some were shot instantly. Others were electrocuted. A few managed to break through gaps created by explosions or fire. The ground outside the camp became a killing field. Guards mounted machine guns and opened fire on the escaping prisoners. Bodies fell in clusters. Screams mixed with gunfire, smoke, and the crackle of burning buildings. Yet even under this onslaught, prisoners kept running. For the first time since Treblinka had been built, the victims were no longer moving toward death under orders. They were moving away from it under their own will. Approximately 300 prisoners escaped the camp during the uprising. Fewer than half would survive the manhunt that followed. German units, local police, and collaborators scoured the forests and villages, hunting the escapees relentlessly. Many were captured and executed within days. But some survived. Those who did carried with them something the Nazis had never intended to leave: Treblinka, testimony. Inside the camp, the uprising marked the beginning of the end. The SS quickly regained control, executing remaining prisoners and suppressing all resistance. But the damage was irreversible. The illusion of secrecy had been destroyed. The camp had burned. Witnesses had escaped. Rumors spread beyond the region. Within weeks, the Nazis began dismantling Treblinka. Gas chambers were destroyed. Mass graves were covered. Buildings were torn down. The land was plowed over and turned into a farm, complete with a house and livestock, to disguise what had once stood there. Trees were planted to erase the scars. Guards were reassigned. Records were eliminated. Treblinka was meant to vanish as if it had never existed. But the uprising ensured it never would. Survivors would later testify at trials, write memoirs, and speak to historians. They described the camp's layout, its procedures, its cruelty, and its final moments. Their accounts matched. The evidence accumulated. The truth emerged despite every attempt to bury it. The uprising was not a military victory. It did not save most of the prisoners, but it was a moral and historical rupture. It proved that even in a place designed to strip people of identity, strength, and hope, resistance was still possible. Treblinka was built to kill silently. It was destroyed in fire and defiance. In the next chapter, we will step back to examine the broader machinery of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi program that created Treblinka and other extermination camps, and how industrialized genocide reshaped Europe forever. Chapter 3, Segment 1, Operation Reinhard, the blueprint of industrialized murder. Treblinka did not exist in isolation. It was not an accident, nor the result of chaos or battlefield necessity. It was the product of planning, paperwork, meetings, and signatures. To understand Treblinka fully, it must be placed inside the larger structure that created it, a program known as Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard was a Nazi plan to exterminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. It was conceived not as a spontaneous response to war, but as a calculated administrative project designed to remove millions of people as efficiently and invisibly as possible. The operation was named after Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, assassinated in 1942. His death did not halt the plan. It accelerated it. By 1941, Nazi leadership had already moved beyond mass shootings and ghettos as their primary methods of killing. These methods were deemed inefficient, psychologically taxing for the perpetrators, and too visible. What the regime wanted instead was a system that functioned quietly, continuously, and at scale. Operation Reinhard was the answer. 3 primary extermination camps were built under this program: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Each was designed with the same singular purpose. Unlike concentration camps, which used forced labor and prolonged imprisonment, these camps existed almost exclusively to kill. Deportees were not meant to stay. They were meant to disappear. Treblinka was the deadliest of the 3. The camp's location was chosen carefully. It lay near a railway junction, allowing transports from across the general government region to arrive quickly. It was surrounded by forests and sparse villages, reducing the risk of witnesses. The area had already been marked by earlier mass killings, making secrecy easier to maintain. Operation Reinhard functioned through a bureaucratic machine that stretched across occupied Europe. Jewish councils were ordered to compile lists. Rail authorities scheduled transports. Local police enforced deportations. German administrators tracked numbers, property, and valuables. Everything was recorded, categorized, and processed. Human beings became entries on ledgers. Upon arrival at Treblinka, victims were stripped not only of their clothing, but of their identities. Names were irrelevant. Age, profession, family ties, all meaningless within the logic of the camp. What mattered was speed. How quickly a transport could be unloaded. How efficiently bodies could be removed. How many people could be killed in a single day. The Nazis referred to this process with euphemisms. Resettlement, special treatment, processing. These words appeared in documents, memos, and reports, creating distance between the administrators and the reality on the ground. Language became a tool of denial, even as the killing continued. Operation Reinhard was also an operation of theft. Victims' possessions were systematically looted. Clothing was sorted. Shoes were bundled. Gold teeth were extracted. Hair was collected. Money and valuables were sent to Berlin. The economic exploitation of murdered Jews became an integral part of the operation, funding further war efforts and enriching individual perpetrators. Nothing was wasted, not even the dead. The men who staffed Treblinka were not elite soldiers. Many were middle-aged, poorly educated, or drawn from earlier euthanasia programs. Some were SS officers. Others were auxiliary guards recruited from occupied territories. They were trained not in combat, but in procedure, how to move people, how to enforce compliance, how to kill without hesitation. Obedience mattered more than ideology. Within this system, Treblinka operated as a killing factory. Trains arrived daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Entire communities vanished within hours of reaching the camp. There were no selections for labor on most days. Children, the elderly, the sick, the strong, all were treated the same. Operation Reinhard reached its peak in 1942 and early 1943. During this period, the majority of Polish Jews were murdered. Ghettos were emptied. Cities that had held Jewish populations for centuries were left silent. Synagogues stood abandoned. Homes were seized. Neighborhoods erased. Treblinka processed death at a pace unmatched by any other camp. Yet, even as the killing intensified, the Nazis were already planning for concealment. As the war turned against Germany, Operation Reinhard camps were dismantled one by one. Evidence was destroyed. Witnesses were murdered. Landscapes were altered to hide what had occurred. Treblinka was not meant to be remembered. But memory survived through fragments, through survivors, through documents overlooked, through testimonies gathered after the war. Operation Reinhard failed in its final goal. It did not erase its victims completely. It left behind questions, scars, and an obligation to remember. In the next segment, we will look closer at the people who made Operation Reinhard function. The administrators, commanders, and ordinary men who turned policy into mass murder, and how responsibility was later denied, deflected, or quietly forgotten. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The men who ran Treblinka, ordinary faces behind extraordinary crimes. Treblinka did not kill on its own. The camp was a collection of wooden structures, barbed wire, rail tracks, and machinery. What transformed it into one of the deadliest places in human history were the people who operated it. Understanding Treblinka requires looking directly at those individuals, not as monsters from mythology, but as men who woke each morning, followed routines, and carried out mass murder as daily work. The command structure of Treblinka was deliberately small. At any given time, fewer than 30 German personnel ran the entire operation. This was not because the Nazis lacked manpower, but because efficiency was the goal. A small, tightly controlled group reduced the risk of dissent, leaks, and emotional breakdowns. It also made accountability easier to avoid after the war. At the top was the camp commandant. The first commandant, Irmfried Eberl, had previously worked in the Nazi euthanasia program, where disabled and mentally ill Germans were murdered in gas chambers disguised as medical facilities. That program became the training ground for extermination camps. Eberl was not a battlefield officer. He was an administrator of death. Under Eberl's command, Treblinka descended quickly into chaos. Transports arrived faster than bodies could be disposed of. Corpses piled up. Disease spread. The stench traveled for kilometers. Even within the Nazi system, this was considered unacceptable, not because of moral concerns, but because inefficiency threatened secrecy. Eberl was removed and replaced by Franz Stangl. Stangl was also a veteran of the euthanasia program. Calm, well-dressed, and methodical, he viewed Treblinka as a logistical challenge rather than a moral one. Survivors later described him as polite, soft-spoken, and terrifyingly detached. He wore a crisp uniform. He maintained order. He ensured that transports were processed smoothly. Stangl referred to victims as cargo. Under his leadership, Treblinka became more efficient than ever. Killing rates increased. The camp was expanded. New gas chambers were built. Procedures were refined. Everything was designed to reduce delays and maintain the illusion of normality for as long as possible. Below Stangl were SS officers responsible for specific tasks: arrivals, guard discipline, property sorting, and punishment. Many of them were men who had failed in civilian life or military service. Treblinka gave them power, authority, and impunity. They enforced obedience through terror. Beatings were random and public. Executions were carried out for minor infractions. Sadism was common. Guards invented games, humiliations, and punishments to assert control. Violence was not always ordered. Often, it was encouraged implicitly, creating a culture where cruelty became a form of entertainment. Alongside the German staff were auxiliary guards, many recruited from Soviet prisoners of war. These men, often referred to as Troniki guards, came from Ukraine, Latvia, and other occupied regions. They were promised better treatment and survival in exchange for service. Their role was critical. They guarded perimeters, escorted victims, enforced discipline. They were the visible face of violence for most prisoners. While they did not design the system, they made it function. Many were brutal. Some were indifferent. A few attempted small acts of mercy, though such actions were rare and dangerous. Within the camp existed another group, the Jewish forced laborers, known as Sonderkommando prisoners. These men were compelled to assist in the operation of death itself. They unloaded trains, removed bodies, sorted belongings, cleaned killing areas. They were not collaborators. They were hostages. Their survival depended on obedience. Refusal meant immediate death. Compliance bought time, days, weeks, sometimes months, until they, too, were murdered and replaced. The Nazis ensured that no witnesses survived for long. The psychological toll on these men was immense. Survivors later described living in a state of numbness, dissociation, and despair. They were forced to participate in the destruction of their own people under threat of death with no illusion of rescue. The German staff exploited this trauma deliberately. They used Jewish prisoners to maintain order, enforce routines, and calm incoming transports. Victims were more likely to trust someone who spoke their language, who looked like them, who reassured them in familiar tones. This deception was systematic. Camp personnel practiced routines designed to reduce panic. Signs were posted. Orders were delivered calmly. Victims were told they would shower, be disinfected, receive food. Even children were soothed. Mothers were encouraged to stay calm for their family's sake. Behind this calm exterior was total control. The men who ran Treblinka understood the importance of psychological manipulation. Fear was effective, but confusion was even more powerful. By the time victims realized the truth, it was too late to resist. After the war, many of these men claimed they were merely following orders. Some insisted they had no choice. Others denied involvement entirely. Records were destroyed. Witnesses were dead. Years passed before accountability caught up with even a few perpetrators. Franz Stangl lived quietly for years after the war, working in factories, raising a family, blending into civilian life. When he was finally arrested and tried, he expressed regret, not for the victims, but for being part of something bad. This distinction mattered. Treblinka was not run by supernatural evil. It was run by men who chose careers, followed incentives, obeyed systems, and abandoned moral responsibility. Their ordinariness is what makes Treblinka so terrifying. It demonstrates how bureaucracy, obedience, and ideology can transform everyday individuals into instruments of mass murder. In the next segment, we will turn our focus away from the perpetrators and toward the victims, examining who was sent to Treblinka, where they came from, and how entire communities were erased within the span of a single train journey. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The Victims of Treblinka, Communities Erased in a Single Journey. The story of Treblinka cannot be understood only through its perpetrators or its machinery. At its center were the victims, hundreds of thousands of individuals whose lives were uprooted, compressed into rail cars, and extinguished within hours of arrival. Treblinka did not destroy anonymous masses. It destroyed families, neighborhoods, professions, languages, songs, memories, and futures. Most of those sent to Treblinka were Jews from occupied Poland, though victims also arrived from Germany, Austria, France, Greece, Slovakia, and the Netherlands. Entire Jewish communities were designated for resettlement, a word that appeared on official notices, train schedules, and Nazi correspondence. It suggested movement, not annihilation. People were told they were being relocated for work or safety. Many believed it because the alternative was too unthinkable. Deportations often began at dawn. Ghettos were surrounded by armed guards. Loudspeakers announced orders. Families were given minutes to gather belongings. Elderly people were dragged from beds. Children were lifted into carts. Those who resisted were beaten or shot. Streets filled with panic and disbelief as people were forced toward assembly points, often train stations they had passed their entire lives. At the platforms, chaos took on a ritualized form. Names were rarely checked. Documents were meaningless. The sick, the elderly, and children were not spared. People were herded into cattle cars, sealed wooden wagons designed for freight, not human beings. There was little air, no sanitation, no water. Doors were bolted shut from the outside. Journeys lasted hours or days. Inside the cars, time lost meaning. People fainted. Children cried until their voices disappeared. Some died before the train stopped. Others stood pressed together so tightly they could not move even when legs gave out. Survivors later recalled the silence that followed panic, a silence born of exhaustion and fear. When trains finally arrived at Treblinka, there was no dramatic announcement. The doors opened to shouting, barking dogs, and armed guards. Prisoners were ordered out quickly. Bodies were removed without ceremony. The living were forced into lines. Any attempt to pause, to look around, to ask questions was punished immediately. Families were separated within minutes. Men were pulled one direction, women and children another. Parents were told they would reunite later. Many tried to remain calm for their children's sake, believing that cooperation meant survival. This hope was not foolish. It was human. Victims were stripped of their possessions. Suitcases were taken, jewelry removed, documents collected, money confiscated. Even wedding rings were pried from fingers. Everything was cataloged and sorted. Nothing was wasted. Clothing would be reused. Valuables sent to Berlin. Hair collected. Shoes stacked in enormous piles. The people themselves were treated as temporary materials. Those deemed fit for labor were selected, a small fraction of arrivals. They were forced into work units, knowing that survival was temporary. Most were driven directly toward the killing area, disguised as a bathing facility. Signs pointed the way. Orders were delivered calmly. The illusion was maintained to the very end. What makes Treblinka distinct among extermination camps is its speed. Most victims were murdered within 2 hours of arrival. There was no registration, no prisoner numbers tattooed, no long-term barracks for the condemned. Treblinka existed to erase people so completely that no trace of their presence would remain. Entire towns vanished in a single day. In some cases, survivors later realized that everyone they had ever known, teachers, neighbors, shopkeepers, classmates, had been sent on the same transport. No one returned. No letters arrived. No graves were marked. Communities that had existed for centuries were extinguished in a matter of hours. The Nazis understood the power of this erasure. Records were minimal. Names were unnecessary. The fewer documents created, the fewer questions could be asked later. Treblinka was designed not only to kill, but to make killing forgettable. And yet, memory survived. A small number of prisoners lived long enough to observe patterns, remember names, and record details in their minds. Some hid notes. Others memorized sequences. A few survived the war and testified. Their accounts allow us to reconstruct what the Nazis tried to destroy. They remembered faces. They remembered lullabies sung in rail cars. Prayers whispered under breath. Parents trying to distract children with stories. Elderly men clutching prayer books. women braiding hair one last time. These moments did not stop death, but they affirmed humanity in its presence. Treblinka's victims were not passive. Some resisted quietly, sharing water, calming the frightened, refusing to abandon children. Others resisted actively, gathering information, planning escape, sabotaging work. Resistance did not always mean survival. Often, it meant choosing how to die. The scale of loss is difficult to comprehend. Historians estimate that between 870,000 and 925,000 people were murdered at Treblinka in just over a year. The vast majority were Jews. Roma victims were also killed. The camp operated for such a short time, yet its death toll rivals those of camps that existed far longer. Treblinka did not need decades. It functioned with ruthless efficiency, fueled by ideology, obedience, and indifference. But it failed in one crucial way. It did not succeed in erasing its victims from history. Every testimony, every recovered name, every remembered story pushes back against that goal. In the next chapter, we will examine how Treblinka's system of death eventually encountered resistance from within, how prisoners, stripped of everything, still found the courage to rise up against a machine built to ensure their silence. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Inside the Machinery of Death. How Treblinka operated day after day. By the time Treblinka reached full operation in the summer of 1942, the camp no longer resembled a temporary installation. It had become a finely tuned system of extermination, designed not only to kill on an industrial scale, but to do so quietly, efficiently, and with as little disruption as possible. Everything within its fences served a single purpose. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was improvised. Treblinka was divided into two main sections. The first, often referred to as the reception area, was where transports arrived and where the illusion of resettlement was carefully staged. The second, hidden behind camouflage and fencing, was the killing zone. Prisoners called it the upper camp. Very few people entered it and returned alive. The deception began immediately upon arrival. Trains pulled into a small station built specifically to resemble an ordinary rural stop. There were signs, timetables, and even a clock. SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliaries shouted instructions with practiced authority. Prisoners were told they had arrived at a transit camp and would soon be sent onward. Calm was essential. Panic slowed the process. Men and women were separated within minutes. This separation was not only psychological. It allowed guards to control the flow of people and prevented organized resistance. Families were broken apart before anyone fully understood where they were. Many never realized they were in Treblinka at all. Those selected for forced labor were removed from the main group. They were a small minority. Their tasks were grim and repetitive. Sorting clothing, carrying bodies, cleaning the grounds, cutting hair, repairing buildings. These prisoners lived under constant threat. Any sign of weakness, illness, or defiance meant immediate execution. Survival depended on obedience and luck. The majority were driven forward. They were ordered to undress quickly, often under the supervision of prisoners wearing armbands. Instructions were delivered with false reassurance. People were told they were going to bathe and be disinfected. Mothers were told to remember their clothing piles. Shoes were tied together to make retrieval easier. The process was designed to move quickly, not gently. From there, victims were forced along a narrow fenced path. Prisoners called it the tube. High walls of branches and barbed wire prevented anyone from seeing where it led. Guards beat those who slowed down. Screams echoed briefly, then disappeared. At the end of the path stood the gas chambers. The chambers were disguised as shower facilities. They were low concrete buildings with sealed doors. Inside, there were no showers, no hydrants, no windows. Victims were packed tightly into the space. When the doors were closed, engines were started. Carbon monoxide filled the chambers. Death followed within minutes. Afterward, the doors were opened. Forced laborers removed the bodies. Gold teeth were extracted. Hair was cut. The dead were searched one final time. Corpses were buried in mass graves during the early phase of the camp's operation. Later, as evidence mounted and the Nazis feared discovery, bodies were exhumed and burned on open-air grates. This process repeated itself relentlessly. Transport after transport arrived. The camp operated at a pace that left no room for mourning or reflection. Guards rotated shifts. Commanders reviewed efficiency. Delays were punished. Speed was rewarded. The men who ran Treblinka understood their task clearly. Camp commanders such as Irmfried Eberl and later Franz Stangl were not improvising murder. They were administrators overseeing a production line. They monitored numbers. They enforced discipline. They demanded results. Stangl later admitted that he viewed the prisoners not as people, but as cargo. Ukrainian guards played a central role. Trained at the Treblinka camp, these auxiliaries enforced order, carried out beatings, and escorted prisoners to their deaths. Their presence allowed the SS to distance themselves from the daily brutality, though responsibility remained entirely with the Nazi system that employed them. Punishment was constant. Public executions were staged to instill fear. Prisoners were forced to watch as others were beaten, shot, or hanged for minor infractions. These acts were not spontaneous cruelty. They were deliberate tools of control. Yet even within this system, cracks appeared. Prisoners noticed patterns. They observed guard routines. They learned which officers were careless. They memorized details, times, numbers, procedures. Knowledge became a form of resistance. Survival became a way to bear witness. Treblinka was not chaotic. It was organized, structured, and methodical. That is what makes it so disturbing. The camp demonstrates how genocide can be carried out not only through hatred, but through bureaucracy, routine, and obedience. And still, the system was not invincible. The very prisoners forced to operate Treblinka's machinery would eventually turn that knowledge against it. In the next segment, we will explore how awareness slowly transformed into defiance, and how the seeds of rebellion were planted inside one of the most lethal places on Earth. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Living on Borrowed Time, Prisoners, Fear, and the Slow Birth of Resistance. For the prisoners forced to remain alive inside Treblinka, survival was never measured in years or even months. It was measured in hours. Each sunrise carried uncertainty. Each night brought the quiet question of whether morning would come again. Life inside the camp was not living in any ordinary sense. It was existence under constant threat, shaped entirely by fear, exhaustion, and the knowledge that death was always close. The prisoners who were spared immediate murder were selected for utility, not mercy. They were chosen because their labor was needed to maintain the machinery of extermination. Some worked unloading trains. Others sorted the belongings of the dead. Some cleaned barracks or repaired fences. A few were assigned to the most horrifying task of all, handling bodies after the gas chambers had done their work. None of these roles offered safety that a prisoner could be killed at any moment for the smallest mistake. Dropping an object, looking at a guard incorrectly, moving too slowly, appearing weak. Illness was a death sentence. Injury meant replacement. There was always another transport arriving. Food was scarce and intentionally inadequate. Prisoners were fed thin soup, scraps of bread, and sometimes nothing at all. Hunger was constant. It hollowed the body and clouded the mind. Many prisoners spoke later of hunger as a second enemy, slowly draining strength and hope. Malnutrition made work harder, mistakes more likely, and punishment inevitable. Disease spread easily. Overcrowded living quarters, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems created ideal conditions for illness. Typhus, dysentery, and infections took lives quietly, without ceremony. Those who became visibly sick were usually removed and killed. There was no medical care for prisoners. Doctors existed only to keep laborers functioning as long as possible. Violence was routine and public. Beatings were carried out openly. Guards used whips, rifle butts, clubs, and their bare hands. Punishment was often collective. If one prisoner faltered, others were punished alongside them. This ensured that fear spread quickly and that prisoners policed one another in an attempt to survive. The psychological toll was overwhelming. Prisoners were forced to assist in the destruction of their own people. They sorted children's shoes, folded clothing still warm from human bodies, heard the screams from the gas chambers day after day. Many spoke later of emotional numbness, a state where feeling became impossible because feeling meant collapse. And yet, even here, human bonds formed. Friendships developed quietly, often without words. Prisoners shared food when they could. They whispered names, prayers, memories. They spoke of families, of cities left behind, of lives that once felt real. These small acts of connection became acts of defiance. They reminded prisoners that they were still human. Some prisoners began to notice patterns. They observed guard routines. Shift changes. Drunkenness among certain officers. Times when supervision weakened. They noticed where weapons were stored, where keys were kept, which fences were weakest. This knowledge was gathered slowly, cautiously, and in silence. The idea of resistance did not appear suddenly. At first, it seemed impossible. The camp was surrounded by armed guards, watchtowers, and barbed wire. Prisoners were starving, exhausted, and unarmed. Any attempt at rebellion appeared suicidal. But despair itself began to shift the calculation. Many prisoners came to understand a brutal truth: they were not meant to survive. No matter how obedient, how useful, or how careful, their fate was sealed. Labor units were periodically liquidated and replaced. Survival offered no future, only delay. This realization changed everything. That if death was inevitable, then fear lost some of its power. Prisoners began to ask different questions. Not how to survive forever, but how to die with meaning. How to leave evidence. How to strike back, even once. Small acts of resistance began to emerge. Tools were hidden. Information was shared discreetly. Certain prisoners with access to administrative areas began copying layouts from memory. Others established secret communication between work groups. These efforts were fragile and dangerous. Discovery meant immediate execution. Leadership emerged quietly. Men like Julian Korzicki, a former Polish army officer, became central figures. He understood organization, discipline, and secrecy. Though he would later be killed before the uprising took place, his role in shaping early resistance was crucial. Others continued his work after his death. Trust was difficult. The camp relied on informers and fear to prevent unity. Prisoners did not know who might betray them to survive one more day. Resistance required silence, patience, and careful selection of participants. One mistake could doom everyone. And still, the plan grew. The goal was not victory. It was escape, destruction, testimony, to break the illusion of control, even briefly. To show the world that Treblinka was not a place of silence alone. Prisoners understood the risk completely. They knew most would die. They knew retaliation would be brutal. But they also knew that Treblinka existed because the world did not see it, because it operated without witnesses, because its victims vanished without voices. The uprising, when it came, would be an act of memory as much as rebellion. In the next segment, we will follow the final preparations, the smuggling of weapons, the coordination of labor units, and the fragile hope that turned desperation into action inside one of the most lethal camps ever built. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The Treblinka Uprising, when silence finally broke. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka had already fulfilled much of its murderous purpose. Millions were dead, entire communities erased. And yet, inside the camp, the machinery of extermination continued to grind forward, even as the Nazis began preparing to dismantle evidence of what they had done. For the prisoners who remained alive, time was running out faster than ever before. They could feel it. Transports were slowing. Mass graves were being dug up. Bodies were burned instead of buried. Buildings were dismantled. Trees were planted to disguise the land. Treblinka was being erased, just as its victims had been. And with that erasure would come the final liquidation of the remaining prisoners. This knowledge hardened resolve. The resistance group understood that the window for action was closing. If they waited, there would be no chance at all. The uprising had to happen soon, even if it meant near certain death. The plan was born from desperation and precision. Weapons would be stolen quietly from the armory. Guards would be distracted. Fires would be set to create confusion. Prisoners would break through the fences and scatter into the surrounding forests. There was no illusion that most would survive. The goal was disruption, escape for some, and proof that Treblinka had existed. Every detail mattered. Keys were copied in secret. Timings were memorized. Roles were assigned carefully. Only a fraction of prisoners were informed, to reduce the risk of betrayal. Even among participants, few knew the full plan. Compartmentalization was survival. Fear was constant. Guards patrolled relentlessly. Any unusual behavior could result in execution. Prisoners practiced normalcy while carrying the weight of impending rebellion. The tension was unbearable, but silence held. On August 2nd, 1943, the uprising began to started with deception. Prisoners gained access to the armory under false pretenses. Guns, grenades, and ammunition were distributed quickly and quietly. Almost immediately, the plan began to unravel. A guard noticed something was wrong. Shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Prisoners attacked guards with whatever they had. Fires were set to barracks, fuel tanks, and administrative buildings. Smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles. Sirens sounded. Guards opened fire indiscriminately. The camp descended into violence. Some prisoners were killed instantly. Others were wounded, but hundreds ran. They tore through barbed wire. They crossed minefields. They fled into forests and fields under heavy gunfire. Many fell. Some made it beyond the perimeter. The Nazis responded with overwhelming force. Machine guns cut down escapees. Reinforcements arrived quickly. Dogs were released. The surrounding countryside was sealed off. A massive manhunt began immediately. Of the approximately 700 prisoners in the camp that day, around 300 managed to escape the camp itself. Fewer than 100 survived the war. And yet, the uprising succeeded. Treblinka burned. Buildings were destroyed. Documents were lost. The illusion of secrecy was shattered. News of the revolt spread. Survivors carried testimony. The world would eventually learn what Treblinka was. For the Nazis, the response was swift. They accelerated the camp's destruction. Remaining prisoners were murdered. The site was leveled. A farmhouse was built to disguise the land. Crops were planted. The killing center ceased to exist physically, but not historically. The uprising ensured that Treblinka could never fully disappear. Survivors like Samuel Willenberg and Richard Glazer later testified in detail about the camp's operations. Their words became evidence. Their memories became history. The resistance at Treblinka was not about victory in a military sense that IT was about dignity, that IT was about refusing to vanish quietly, that IT was about ensuring that even in a place built to erase humanity, humanity fought back. The prisoners of Treblinka did not have armies. They did not have allies. They did not have hope of survival. And still, they chose action over silence. Their rebellion stands today as one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance during the Holocaust. In the next chapter, we will examine the immediate aftermath, the manhunts, the survivors' journeys, and how Treblinka was deliberately erased from the physical world, even as its memory began its long fight to survive. Chapter 5, Segment 1. After the flames, the hunt for the survivors. When the smoke from Treblinka's uprising began to thin, the camp no longer resembled the efficient machine of extermination it had been designed to be. Buildings smoldered, fences were torn, bodies lay scattered across the grounds. For the first time since its creation, Treblinka had lost control of its prisoners, and that loss terrified the Nazi command. The escape itself was only the beginning. Within minutes of the uprising, German guards radioed for reinforcements. Nearby police units, SS detachments, and auxiliary forces were mobilized. Roads were sealed. Villages were warned. Forests were surrounded. What followed was not a search. It was a manhunt. The escapees ran without direction. Many had no maps, no food, no weapons, and no understanding of the terrain beyond the camp's fences. Some were barefoot. Others were wounded. Most were weakened by months or years of starvation and forced labor. Still, they ran, driven by instinct rather than strategy. Behind them came gunfire. Machine guns rattled from watchtowers. Dogs were released. Bullets cut through trees and brush. Anyone spotted was shot without warning. The surrounding countryside became an extension of the camp, a wide killing zone where escape itself was treated as a crime punishable by immediate death. Some prisoners fell within minutes. Others survived hours, days, even weeks before being captured or killed. The Nazis relied heavily on local collaborators and coerced civilians, threatening entire villages with punishment if escapees were hidden or aided. Fear spread quickly. Helping a Jew could mean execution. Despite this, some people did help. Farmers left bread at forest edges. Families whispered directions. Partisans hid survivors briefly before moving on. These acts were rare and dangerous, but they saved lives. Most escapees did not survive. Many were betrayed for food or money. Others were caught by patrols or died from exhaustion and exposure. The forests that had promised freedom became graveyards. Silence returned, but it was different now. It carried memory. For those who survived the initial escape, survival became a second test. They lived in hiding. They changed names. They avoided roads. They trusted almost no one. Each sound could be a patrol. Each knock could be death. Survival required constant vigilance and luck. Some joined partisan units. Others survived alone, moving from place to place, surviving on scraps and chance kindness. Winter was approaching, and the dangers multiplied. Hunger returned. Illness spread. Hope flickered. Meanwhile, at Treblinka, the Nazis moved quickly. The camp was officially closed. Remaining prisoners, those who had not escaped, were murdered. Gas chambers were dismantled. Crematoria were destroyed. Ashes were scattered. The ground was plowed and planted. Trees were brought in. A farmhouse was built. A Ukrainian guard was installed to pose as a farmer. The goal was total erasure. Treblinka was to become invisible, but invisibility failed. Rumors spread. Reports surfaced. Survivors reached ghettos and partisan groups. The Polish underground began documenting what they heard. Couriers carried information to the Allies. Slowly, The outline of Treblinka emerged from fragments of testimony. Even as the Nazis attempted to wipe away the physical evidence, the human evidence multiplied. After the war, survivors returned, not to a camp, but to an empty field. There were no barracks, no fences, no gas chambers, only disturbed earth, strange stones, and silence. Yet they knew where everything had been. Memory mapped the land where structures no longer stood. Their testimonies would become crucial at the T-war crimes trials. Treblinka survivors described selections, deportations, gas chambers, and mass murder in precise detail. Their accounts corroborated each other. The camp that had been designed to leave no witnesses now had many. The manhunt failed in its most important objective. IT failed to kill the truth. In the next segment, we will follow the survivors who lived long enough to speak, how they carried Treblinka into courtrooms, classrooms, and history books, and how their voices rebuilt what the Nazis tried to erase. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Voices that Refuse to Disappear. For those who survived Treblinka, freedom did not bring peace. It brought responsibility. Every survivor carried something heavier than memory. The knowledge that nearly everyone they had known was gone, and that the world might never believe what had happened. Treblinka had been designed not only to kill people, but to kill proof. The Nazis had counted on silence. The survivors understood that silence was now the final enemy. Many of them stayed hidden until the war ended. They lived under false names, moving cautiously through occupied Poland, forests, farms, and partisan-controlled areas. Some joined resistance groups. Others survived alone, relying on instinct and secrecy. Each day, alive, felt borrowed. Each day carried the weight of the dead. When the war finally ended in 1945, survivors emerged into a world struggling to comprehend what had occurred. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Entire families were gone. And yet, even amid this devastation, Treblinka still seemed unbelievable to many. A place built solely to murder. A camp where trains arrived full and left empty. A facility where human beings were reduced to smoke and ash within hours. Survivors began to speak. They spoke first to investigators, then to commissions, then to courts. Their testimonies were detailed, painful, and often re-traumatizing. They described layouts of the camp from memory. They named guards. They explained procedures. They recalled numbers, timings, commands, and sounds, the rhythm of death that had governed daily life. Some survivors could draw Treblinka from memory. They sketched the undressing barracks, the path known as the tube, the gas chambers, the cremation pits. They described smells that never left them. They recalled screams that echoed even in dreams decades later. These testimonies became evidenced at the Nuremberg trials and later proceedings in Germany, Poland, and Israel. Treblinka survivors provided crucial proof that extermination camps existed and operated as part of a centralized plan. Their words helped dismantle denial. They turned rumor into record, but speaking came at a cost. Many survivors were met with disbelief. Others were accused of exaggeration. Some were told to move on, to forget, to rebuild quietly. Trauma was poorly understood. Silence was often encouraged. Survivors carried their memories largely alone, yet many refused to stop. They wrote memoirs. They gave interviews. They spoke in schools. They stood before cameras and microphones and relived the worst moments of their lives, so the world could not claim ignorance. Their voices became bridges between the dead and the living. One survivor said, "I speak because they cannot." Another said, "If I am silent, Treblinka wins." As decades passed, fewer survivors remained. Time did what violence could not. It thinned their numbers. With each passing year, urgency grew. Memory had to be preserved before it faded into history books alone. Historians listened. Researchers cross-referenced testimonies with documents, transport lists, Nazi correspondence, and aerial photographs. What survivors said matched what records confirmed. Treblinka was real. Its purpose was clear. Its scale was undeniable. The camp that had been meant to vanish left one of the deepest scars in human history. Even today, much of what we know about Treblinka comes directly from survivor accounts. Without them, the camp might exist only as a rumor, a name without detail. Their courage turned absence into evidence. And yet, even as survivors spoke, questions remained. How could such a place be built so quickly? How could it operate so efficiently? How could so many people participate? And how could the world have known so little while it was happening? Those questions lead beyond Treblinka itself. They lead to systems, to ideology, to obedience, to indifference that in the next segment, we will look outward beyond the survivors to the broader world after Treblinka. How justice was pursued, how many perpetrators escaped, and how memory became a battlefield long after the camp was gone. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Justice delayed, justice denied. When the war ended, Treblinka no longer existed as a functioning place. The buildings were gone, the gas chambers destroyed, the earth flattened and disguised as farmland. What remained was memory and the question of accountability. For the survivors, justice was not an abstract idea. It was personal. It meant names, faces, uniforms, and voices that still haunted them. It meant the men who had shouted orders, who had laughed, who had beaten prisoners, who had overseen death as routine work. It meant the guards who had gone home each night after killing thousands, and the officers who had signed papers from behind desks. But justice moved slowly in the immediate aftermath of the war. Europe was overwhelmed. Millions were displaced. Nations were rebuilding. Courts were flooded with cases. And while the largest Nazi leaders were prosecuted, many mid-level perpetrators slipped away into anonymity. Some Treblinka guards fled west. Others returned to ordinary lives. Some changed names. Others relied on the chaos of post-war Europe to disappear completely. A number of Treblinka personnel were captured and tried, but many were not. Survivors watched as years passed and familiar faces never appeared in courtrooms. They saw former guards living freely, raising families, working normal jobs. The absence of accountability deepened the wound. It felt as though the dead were being erased a second time, not by violence, but by neglect. Eventually, investigations resumed in the 1950s and 1960s. West Germany began reopening Holocaust cases. Prosecutors tracked down former camp personnel, often relying on survivor testimony to identify them. These trials were difficult. Memories were challenged. Evidence was incomplete. Defendants claimed ignorance, coercion, or minor involvement. Some were convicted. Others were acquitted. Sentences, when given, often felt inadequate compared to the scale of the crimes. A man responsible for thousands of deaths might receive a few years in prison. Survivors struggled to reconcile legal punishment with moral responsibility. Justice, they realized, would never feel complete. At the same time, denial began to surface. Some groups questioned whether Treblinka had truly existed as an extermination camp. Others claimed the numbers were exaggerated. A few insisted the survivors were mistaken or dishonest. These claims were deeply painful. They attacked not only historical truth, but lived experience. Survivors responded the only way they could, by speaking louder. They testified again. They documented again. They returned to the sites of destruction and pointed to empty ground where gas chambers once stood. They insisted that absence did not mean innocence. That destruction was proof, not denial. Over time, historians, Archivists and educators joined them. Treblinka became one of the most thoroughly documented extermination camps in history, despite the Nazis' efforts to erase it. Transport lists confirmed deportations. German records outlined construction. Survivor sketches matched aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by Allied forces during the war. Truth assembled itself piece by piece. Justice, however, remained imperfect. Many perpetrators died before facing trial. Others were never identified. Some lived long lives without consequence. The imbalance between suffering and punishment remained a painful reality. But another form of justice began to emerge. Remembrance. In 1964, a memorial was established at the Treblinka site. Instead of rebuilding the camp, the land was transformed into a symbolic cemetery. Stone markers represented destroyed Jewish communities. Pathways traced the route of victims. Silence replaced machinery. Memory replaced smoke. Treblinka became a place not of death, but of witness. Survivors returned there, sometimes decades later. They stood on ground where their families had vanished. They spoke names aloud. They told stories to younger generations. They ensured that Treblinka would not fade into abstraction. Education became the final reckoning. WWII teaching what Treblinka was, how it functioned, why it existed, and what it represents. Survivors reclaimed a measure of justice that courts could not provide. They transformed personal trauma into collective responsibility. The camp that had been designed to erase people from history instead became a warning embedded in history. Justice, they learned, does not always come as punishment. Sometimes it comes as memory preserved against time, as truth defended against denial, as names spoken instead of forgotten. Treblinka did not end in 1943. IT continues wherever people remember IT. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into daily life inside the camp itself. Not just how people died, but how they lived in the narrow spaces between transports, selections, and survival. Chapter 6, Segment 1, Life Between Transports. Inside Treblinka, time did not move forward in days or weeks. It moved between arrivals, between whistles, between moments of terror that punctuated long stretches of waiting. For the prisoners forced to live and work inside the camp, existence was defined by what came next and how long they could survive before it did. Treblinka was not designed for long-term imprisonment. It was not a labor camp meant to extract years of work. It was a machine built for speed, for efficiency, for disappearance. And yet, a small number of prisoners were kept alive to operate that machine. Their lives were suspended in a narrow, unstable space between usefulness and death. Most prisoners arrived believing they were being resettled. Those selected for work learned the truth quickly. The smell told them. The sounds told them. The silence afterward told them most clearly of all. Daily life inside Treblinka was a study in contradiction. Extreme motion followed by unbearable stillness. Chaos followed by routine. Terror followed by numbness. Prisoners were divided into work details, each with specific tasks. Some unloaded transports. Others sorted clothing. Some cleaned barracks. A few worked near the gas chambers themselves, disposing of bodies, removing gold teeth, cutting hair, and feeding the cremation fires. These men were known as the Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to participate in the final stages of murder under constant threat of execution. Their survival depended on obedience, speed, and silence. Every morning began with roll call. Guards counted prisoners, often beating or killing those who appeared weak or slow. Numbers mattered more than names. A missing body meant punishment. A collapsed prisoner meant a warning to the rest. Food was scarce and deliberately inadequate. Thin soup, moldy bread. Starvation was not accidental. It was policy. Hunger weakened resistance. It shortened lifespans. It ensured dependence. Prisoners learned to think about food constantly. Dreams were filled with meals that would never come. Conversations revolved around recipes remembered from home, spoken softly, like prayers. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, infections from untreated wounds. Medical care was almost non-existent. A sick prisoner was a liability. Many were simply removed. Others hid their illness as long as possible, working through pain to avoid selection. Despite this, small acts of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared crumbs. They whispered warnings before inspections. They helped each other stand during roll call. They passed messages between work details. These acts were dangerous. Compassion could be fatal. But without them, survival became unbearable. Work near the gas chambers was the most psychologically destructive. Prisoners there witnessed death at a scale that defied comprehension. They learned to separate their minds from their actions, to move mechanically, to avoid looking into faces, to survive by becoming numb. Yet numbness never fully protected them. Many described hearing voices in their sleep, seeing faces in smoke, feeling guilt for surviving when others did not. The Nazis exploited this trauma deliberately. They reminded prisoners that their lives were temporary, that they would be killed once they became too weak or knew too much. Executions occurred frequently and publicly. A single accusation could mean death. A stumble, a glance, a perceived delay. The randomness reinforced fear. No one felt safe. No one believed they would live long. And still, people lived. They formed friendships. They remembered birthdays. They spoke about families left behind. They clung to routines, washing when possible, adjusting clothing, reciting prayers quietly in corners. These rituals asserted humanity in a place designed to erase it. Music sometimes echoed through the camp. Guards forced prisoners to sing while working or marching. The songs were often Jewish folk songs or religious melodies twisted into tools of humiliation. But even these moments carried complexity. For some prisoners, singing became a way to remember who they were before Treblinka. Between transports, the camp felt eerily calm. Trains departed. Fires burned. Ash settled. The air grew quiet. Prisoners cleaned platforms, repaired fences, prepared for the next arrival. They knew it would come. They always did. Waiting became its own torment. Some prisoners prayed for liberation. Others prayed for death. Some prayed simply for one more day. Faith fractured and reformed in countless ways. Belief did not always mean hope. Sometimes it meant endurance. Information traveled quietly. Prisoners heard rumors of resistance elsewhere, of ghettos rising up, of the war turning, of the outside world. These rumors were fragile, easily crushed by despair. But they planted something dangerous in Treblinka. Possibility, the knowledge that the camp was not eternal, that the Nazis could be challenged, that death was certain, but submission was a choice. That weeks turned into months for a few. Something shifted. Survival alone began to feel insufficient. To live only to assist murder felt unbearable. The line between living and dying blurred. For some prisoners, the only remaining form of agency was resistance. That realization would soon change Treblinka forever. In the next segment, we will examine how whispered conversations, stolen tools, and quiet coordination laid the groundwork for one of the most daring acts of defiance inside any Nazi extermination camp, the Treblinka uprising. Chapter 6, Segment 2, Whispers of Resistance. Resistance in Treblinka did not begin with weapons. It began with listening. In a place where speaking openly could mean death, prisoners learned to communicate through glances, pauses, and half-finished sentences. Resistance grew not from grand plans, but from shared understanding. The quiet recognition that survival alone was no longer enough. First, the idea of fighting back felt impossible. Treblinka was sealed off from the world. Armed guards watched every movement. Watchtowers loomed over the fences. The prisoners were malnourished, exhausted, and constantly reminded that their lives were temporary. Any attempt at rebellion seemed doomed before it began. Yet knowledge changed everything. Some prisoners had worked in ghettos before arriving at Treblinka. Others had been transported through multiple camps. A few had overheard guards talking. Slowly, a clearer picture formed. Treblinka was not a place of relocation. No one left, no matter how obedient, no matter how useful. The realization spread quietly. Survival inside the camp did not lead to freedom. It only delayed execution. This understanding transformed fear into resolve. Small groups began to form, cautiously and invisibly. Men who worked near one another tested trust slowly. They spoke in fragments, often while working, never lingering too long on a single topic. Names were avoided. Plans were never spoken fully. Everyone understood that betrayal could come from desperation as easily as malice. Resistance required patience. Prisoners studied routines. They memorized guard movements. They observed where weapons were stored. They noted which guards drank heavily, which ones grew careless, which ones could be distracted. Knowledge became the most valuable currency in the camp. At the same time, moral conflict weighed heavily on them. Resist meant risking the lives of others. A failed uprising could lead to mass executions. Retaliation was certain. Prisoners struggled with the responsibility of deciding not only their own fate, but the fate of those around them. Some argued that resistance would bring only more suffering. Others believed that allowing the camp to continue operating unchallenged was a form of surrender that could not be justified. The debate was quiet, intense, and deeply personal. There was no consensus. Only urgency. Leadership emerged gradually, not through authority, but through competence and trust. Prisoners who had access to different areas of the camp became critical links. A man who worked near the armory, another who sorted clothing and could hide small objects, someone who cleaned administrative areas and overheard conversations. Women played a crucial role as well. Although fewer women were held inside Treblinka compared to other camps, those who were present found ways to assist resistance efforts. Some smuggled small amounts of gunpowder from nearby factories. Others passed messages or hid tools beneath clothing. Their involvement was essential and extraordinarily dangerous. Every item had to be concealed carefully. A nail, a blade, a piece of wire. Nothing could look suspicious. Everything had to blend into the routine of forced labor. Time was the enemy. The Nazis were already planning to dismantle Treblinka. Evidence destruction was underway. Prisoners understood that once the camp closed, they would be killed to eliminate witnesses. The window for resistance was closing. Fear sharpened focus. Plans became more specific. The goal was no longer to overthrow the camp entirely. That was impossible. The goal became escape. Chaos, fire, disruption, anything that would break the machinery of death, even briefly. Hope was fragile, but it existed. Not hope of survival for everyone. Hope of meaning, of defiance, of leaving behind proof that Treblinka had not functioned without resistance. That the victims had not gone quietly. Even as preparations advanced, daily life continued under unbearable conditions. Prisoners still unloaded trains, still sorted clothing, still witnessed death on an industrial scale. They carried this burden while planning rebellion, knowing that discovery would mean immediate execution. The psychological strain was immense. Some prisoners withdrew, unable to cope with the tension. Others volunteered eagerly, preferring death in defiance to survival in submission. Every participant understood the likely outcome. Few believed they would live, but many believed the attempt itself mattered. In whispered conversations, a new language emerged. Words like tomorrow and soon took on enormous weight. A nod could mean readiness. A pause could signal danger. Silence itself became communication. The uprising was no longer theoretical. It was coming. In the next segment, we will follow the final preparations, the moment when whispered plans turned into action, and Treblinka erupted into one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in Holocaust history. Chapter 6, Segment 3, The Treblinka Uprising. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka was a dying machine. The transports were fewer. The gas chambers still functioned, but at a slower pace. Rumors had spread among the guards. Operation Reinhard, the Nazi campaign to exterminate Polish Jewry, was nearing its end. The camp's purpose had almost been fulfilled. For the prisoners forced to operate that machinery of death, this realization carried both dread and determination. They knew what came next: liquidation. Once Treblinka's task was complete, its remaining workers would be executed to erase all traces of the operation. The clock was ticking. If they were to fight, it had to be soon. The uprising began, not with shouting, but with keys that a group of prisoners who worked in the camp's administrative and maintenance zones had slowly gathered intelligence for months. They had learned where weapons were stored, where guards relaxed, and which areas were least monitored. They had also identified weak points in the camp's defenses: the fuel storage tanks, the armory, and the main gate. The plan was simple in its ambition and terrifying in its execution: steal weapons, set the camp ablaze, and flee into the forest. Even if most died, the chaos would cripple Treblinka and give some a chance at freedom. The day chosen was August 2nd, 1943. Morning began as usual. Prisoners marched to their work details under the eyes of guards. The sun was hot, and the air carried its usual stench of smoke and ash. But beneath the surface, everything was different. Every movement, every glance carried weight. Around midday, several prisoners gained access to the armory. The key, smuggled earlier, fit the lock perfectly, a miracle born of months of observation and luck. Inside, they found rifles, pistols, and grenades. The weapons were quickly hidden in wheelbarrows, beneath rags, and among tools. Gunpowder was poured into fuel tanks. Fire would be their ally. When the first flames appeared, confusion spread rapidly. A guard shouted. Another ran toward the smoke. Prisoners dropped their tools. Someone fired the first shot. It's unclear who. Chaos erupted. Alarms blared. The camp, usually governed by mechanical precision, descended into panic. Prisoners attacked guards with whatever they had: axes, shovels, stolen pistols, bare hands. Flames roared through storage sheds and barracks. Explosions followed as fuel ignited. The Nazis, caught off guard, struggled to regain control. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Treblinka belonged to its prisoners. Hundreds ran toward the fences, throwing themselves against the barbed wire, climbing, falling, clawing their way through under fire. Machine guns rattled from the watchtowers. Men and women fell, but others kept running. Some reached the forest, vanishing into the trees. It was chaos, terror, and liberation all at once. The uprising lasted less than an hour, but it shattered the illusion of Nazi control. Nearly half the camp was in flames. Ammunition exploded. Bodies lay everywhere, guards and prisoners alike. The Germans regained control by late afternoon. shooting survivors and sealing the camp once more. Out of the roughly 700 prisoners inside Treblinka that day, around 200 managed to escape beyond the perimeter. Of those, perhaps 70 survived the war. Their testimonies would later become the backbone of what the world knows about Treblinka today. The aftermath was brutal. The SS hunted escapees for days. Entire villages were searched. Locals who helped prisoners were executed. The camp's remaining workers were gathered, interrogated, and killed. Within weeks, Treblinka ceased to function entirely. The Nazis began dismantling what was left, erasing evidence as they had done before. Buildings were torn down. The ground was plowed. Trees were planted over mass graves. The site was transformed into a false farm, complete with a small house for Ukrainian Guard. It was the ultimate act of concealment, to turn genocide into silence. But silence could not hold forever. Those who escaped carried the truth with them. Men like Samuel Rajman, Chio Rajman, and others gave testimony that would outlast the camp itself. They described every detail: the trains, the selections, the chambers, the uprising. Their words became the living memory of those who could not speak. The uprising at Treblinka stands among the most significant acts of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. It did not stop the killing. By the time it happened, over 800,000 people had already perished there, but it reclaimed something the Nazis believed they had destroyed: human defiance. The survivors did not see themselves as heroes. Many spoke of guilt, of terror, of loss. They had seen friends die in front of them. They had left others behind. But their act, the decision to rise up in the heart of an extermination camp, became an enduring symbol of courage under impossible circumstances. In the decades that followed, the story of Treblinka's revolt spread slowly. At first, few wanted to hear it. The scale of the Holocaust overwhelmed comprehension, and the idea that anyone could have resisted seemed inconceivable. But as survivor testimonies emerged, the world began to understand. Resistance had taken many forms, and Treblinka's uprising was among the most extraordinary. It proved that even in a place built solely for death, people could choose how to meet it. They could fight. They could burn the machinery of their oppressors. They could make the ground itself testify against those who sought to erase them. Today, when visitors walk through the Treblinka Memorial, they see stones marking the destroyed communities, the outline of the gas chambers, and a vast field of silence. But beneath that silence lies the echo of August 2nd, 1943, the sound of gunfire, shouts, explosions, and footsteps racing toward freedom. The uprising was not the end of Treblinka's story. It was its turning point, the moment when victims became witnesses and witnesses became the bearers of truth. In the next chapter, we will follow what came after: the dismantling of Treblinka, the Soviet liberation of the region, and the fight to preserve memory in the face of destruction and denial. Chapter 7, Segment 1, Erasing the Crime. After the uprising of August 2nd, 1943, Treblinka entered its final phase, not as a functioning death camp, but as a crime scene the Nazis were determined to erase. The flames from the revolt had exposed what Treblinka truly was, and the German authorities understood that the camp could no longer operate in secrecy. The priority shifted from killing to concealment. For the Nazi leadership, Treblinka had always been temporary. It was built not to last, but to disappear. Unlike concentration camps intended for long-term imprisonment, extermination camps under Operation Reinhard were designed to leave no trace once their purpose was fulfilled. The uprising only accelerated a plan already in motion. The remaining prisoners were forced to dismantle the very structures that had defined their suffering. Under armed guard, they tore down barracks, leveled fences, and destroyed equipment. Gas chambers were dismantled brick by brick. Pipes were removed. Foundations were broken apart. Anything that could testify to mass murder was targeted for destruction. These prisoners understood what this meant. They were being used as tools in the final phase of genocide, the erasure of evidence. And they knew that once their labor was complete, they too would be killed. Every day of work was lived under the certainty of approaching death. Bodies buried in mass graves were exhumed and burned. Ashes were crushed and scattered across fields and rivers. Bones were ground into powder. The landscape itself was forced into silence. This process was part of a broader operation ordered by Heinrich Himmler to conceal the crimes of Operation Reinhard as Allied forces advanced. The work was unimaginably brutal. Prisoners labored among the remains of hundreds of thousands of victims. Family members, neighbors, entire communities reduced to fragments. The physical effort was overwhelming, but the psychological toll was worse. To destroy evidence meant confronting death again and again, without the possibility of mourning. Guards watched closely. Any sign of weakness or resistance was punished immediately. Executions continued. The camp was smaller now, quieter, but no less deadly. As structures disappeared, the Nazis began reshaping the land itself. Trenches were filled. The terrain was leveled. Trees were planted to disguise burial sites. Crops were sown. A farmhouse was constructed and assigned to a Ukrainian guard, creating the illusion that Treblinka had always been an ordinary rural area. The goal was simple. When the war ended, there should be nothing left to find. But even as the Nazis worked to erase Treblinka, fragments of truth survived. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by Allied forces captured unusual activity in the area. Disturbances in the ground, patterns inconsistent with agriculture. Railway records documented transport routes. German correspondents referenced special treatment and resettlement, coded language that would later be deciphered. Most importantly, survivors carried memory. Those who escaped during the uprising and the few who survived dismantling operations became living archives. They memorized layouts. They recalled names. They sketched maps from memory. They described routines, buildings, and methods with precision that would later astonish investigators. The Nazis underestimated memory. They believed that without buildings, there could be no proof. Without bodies, no crime. Without witnesses, no accusation. They did not account for testimony, the fragile but powerful record of human experience that by late 1943, Treblinka ceased to exist as a camp. No transports arrived. No smoke rose from cremation pits. The machinery of death was gone. In its place stood an empty field, deliberately unremarkable to an uninformed observer. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet beneath the soil lay the remains of one of the largest mass murders in human history. The destruction of Treblinka was not an act of mercy. It was an act of fear. Fear that the truth would be discovered. Fear that the scale of the crime would be understood. Fear that silence would fail. And in time, it did it. In the next segment, we will follow the arrival of Soviet forces in the region, the first investigations into what had occurred at Treblinka, and the slow, painful emergence of truth in a world struggling to comprehend what it had lost and what it had allowed to happen. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The first investigations and the silence that followed. When Soviet forces advanced into eastern Poland in the summer of 1944, they did not liberate Treblinka in the way camps like Auschwitz would later be liberated. There were no prisoners to free, no barracks filled with the living, no guards to capture in the act. What they encountered instead was absence, a quiet, cultivated landscape that appeared almost deliberately ordinary. This absence was the final layer of Treblinka's design. The Red Army found a farmhouse, fields, scattered debris, and disturbed soil. No signs announced that nearly 1 million people had been murdered there. Yet even in silence, Treblinka resisted erasure. The ground itself told a story. Soviet investigators, trained to document Nazi crimes, immediately noticed anomalies. Unnatural mounds beneath the soil, ash mixed into the earth, fragments of bone surfacing after rain. The land did not behave like land untouched by catastrophe. When trenches were opened, layers of human remains appeared. Crushed bones, teeth, hair, burned fragments impossible to deny. The Nazis had failed in 1944 and 1945. Soviet war crimes commissions began gathering testimony from nearby villagers, railway workers, and the few survivors who had escaped Treblinka months earlier. Witnesses described endless transports, screams, smoke that smelled of burning flesh, and guards who threatened death for anyone who spoke. These accounts were fragmented, emotional, and often dismissed at first as exaggeration. The scale was simply too large. How could a place that no longer existed have consumed entire cities? The earliest survivor testimonies were met with disbelief, even among those investigating Nazi crimes. Numbers in the hundreds of thousands seemed implausible. Entire communities vanishing without records strained comprehension. Yet as testimonies accumulated, patterns emerged. Consistent layouts, identical descriptions of gas chambers, the same railway spur, the same methods of killing. Truth began to coalesce. Polish Jewish survivors like Samuel Willenberg and Jankiel Wiernik played a crucial role. Wiernik, who had escaped during the uprising, published one of the earliest detailed accounts of Treblinka while the war was still ongoing. He described construction details, camp routines, and the mechanics of mass murder with terrifying clarity. His testimony would later be confirmed repeatedly by archaeology and documentation. Still, Treblinka remained largely invisible in public consciousness for years. The immediate post-war world was overwhelmed with devastation. Europe lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Trials focused on high-ranking Nazis, and attention gravitated toward camps that still stood. Treblinka, dismantled and hidden, slipped into the margins. For survivors, this silence was devastating. Many felt that the world did not want to listen. Their memories were too painful, too unbelievable, too disruptive. Some were told to move on. Others were accused of fabricating horror. The absence of physical structures made denial easier. This denial was not always malicious. Often, it was psychological. The human mind resists truths that challenge its understanding of civilization. Treblinka was not just a crime scene. It was evidence that modern society could industrialize annihilation. During the Nuremberg trials, Operation Reinhard, the program that included Treblinka, received far less attention than Auschwitz. Many perpetrators had fled, been killed, or blended back into civilian life. Documentation had been destroyed. Names were missing. Justice was incomplete. Yet the truth persisted. In the 1950s and 1960s, renewed investigations in West Germany reopened Treblinka's case. Former guards were identified. Commandant Franz Stangl was arrested in Brazil in 1967 and extradited to Germany. His trial forced Treblinka back into public awareness. Stangl did not deny the killings that he spoke of cargo, of efficiency, of duty, language stripped of humanity. His testimony, combined with survivor accounts, finally made Treblinka undeniable in legal terms. He was convicted of responsibility for the murder of at least 400,000 people, though the true number was far higher. Still, for every Stangl, many others escaped justice. Treblinka's story remained incomplete, fractured between memory and neglect. Unlike camps preserved immediately after liberation, Treblinka had to be reconstructed through testimony, archaeology, and relentless insistence by survivors who refused to let the silence win. They understood something crucial. If Treblinka could disappear once, it could disappear again, this time from memory. And so they spoke. They spoke at trials, in classrooms, in memoirs, in quiet rooms where disbelief slowly gave way to recognition. Each testimony rebuilt a wall the Nazis had tried to tear down. Not a wall of confinement, but a wall of truth that, in the next segment, we will explore how Treblinka was finally transformed into a memorial, how archaeology and remembrance reshaped the landscape, and why the act of remembering became a form of resistance long after the killing ended. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Memory Reclaimed. How Treblinka was remembered after it was meant to vanish. For years after the war, Treblinka existed in a strange state, known, yet unseen, documented, yet doubted, remembered by survivors, yet absent from the physical world. Unlike Auschwitz, which stood as a grim structure of brick and wire, Treblinka had been erased so thoroughly that visitors struggled to believe anything had happened there at all. This absence was not accidental. It was the final phase of the crime. The Nazis had not only murdered human beings, they had attempted to murder memory itself. In the immediate post-war years, Poland faced devastation on a scale difficult to comprehend. Cities lay in ruins, populations displaced, and political systems overturned. Within this chaos, Treblinka received little attention. The site remained a neglected field. Locals avoided it, some out of fear, some out of grief, some because the ground itself felt wrong. Survivors who returned described a silence that felt louder than screams. They walked where the gas chambers had stood and found only grass. They searched for landmarks and found none. Even the railway spur had been dismantled. The land had been flattened, replanted, disguised, just as the Nazis had intended. But memory does not require walls. Throughout the 1950s, survivors began organizing efforts to mark the site. They wrote letters, petitioned governments, spoke to journalists, and recorded testimonies. Many did this while still grieving families that had never received graves, names, or final moments. Their motivation was not revenge. It was preservation. They feared a future where Treblinka would be denied, not by ignorance, but by convenience. The first official steps toward memorialization began in the late 1950s, when Polish authorities agreed that Treblinka must be marked, even if little remained. Archaeological surveys confirmed what survivors already knew. Beneath the soil were layers of ash, bone fragments, and human remains. The land itself had become a mass grave. Excavation could be complete. Disturbing the dead was considered both unethical and unbearable. Instead, the decision was made to let the ground speak symbolically. In 1964, the Treblinka Memorial was officially unveiled. It did not resemble traditional monuments. There were no statues of heroes. No triumphant miri. Instead, visitors encountered a field of stones, more than 17,000 of them, each representing a destroyed Jewish community. Some stones bore names. Others remained anonymous, mirroring the countless victims whose identities were lost forever. At the center stood a massive fractured stone, split and jagged, symbolizing both rupture and endurance. It did not offer closure. It offered confrontation. The memorial was intentionally abstract. Treblinka could not be explained through a single structure or narrative. It had to be felt, walked through, absorbed slowly. Visitors moved along the same paths victims once took, from the railway platform to the place where life ended, guided not by buildings, but by absence. Silence became the exhibit. Over time, Treblinka entered global historical consciousness. Survivor memoirs were translated. Scholars connected Operation Reinhard camps into a unified understanding of genocide. Holocaust education expanded, and Treblinka's role as a pure extermination site, a place with no pretense of labor or imprisonment, became clearer. This clarity mattered. Treblinka demonstrated that genocide did not require chaos. It required planning, bureaucracy, infrastructure, and obedience. It revealed how modern systems could be weaponized to annihilate entire populations in months. Yet even as recognition grew, denial followed. Holocaust denial movements often targeted Treblinka precisely because it had been dismantled. They claimed a lack of buildings meant a lack of crime. Survivors responded not with anger, but with evidence, documents, testimonies, forensic findings, and consistency across independent accounts. Memory held that in recent decades, new archaeological methods, non-invasive and respectful, have further confirmed the camp's layout and mass graves without disturbing remains. Ground-penetrating radar revealed burial pits exactly where survivors said they were. The land, once again, told the truth. Today, Treblinka is visited by people from around the world. Many arrive expecting ruins and leave changed by emptiness. The absence forces imagination, empathy, and reflection in a way no reconstructed building could. There is nothing to photograph except stones, sky, and soil. And that is the point. Treblinka does not shout. It whispers, and in that whisper is a warning that genocide does not begin with camps, but with language, with separation, with laws, with walls, with silence, and with the belief that some lives matter less than others. The Nazis failed to erase Treblinka. They failed to erase its victims, and they failed to erase the responsibility of those who remember. In the next chapter, we will turn to the final phase of Treblinka's story, its place in modern memory, education, and why preserving this history is not about the past, but about the future humanity chooses to build. Chapter 8, Segment 1. After the Ashes, Treblinka's place in modern memory and education. In the decades that followed the war, Treblinka slowly moved from a place of private grief to a site of public responsibility. This transformation did not happen all at once, and it did not happen easily. For many years, the world struggled to find language that could hold what Treblinka represented. It was not a camp that could be explained through survival narratives or liberation footage. It was a place defined almost entirely by death, speed, and absence. As Holocaust education expanded globally in the latter half of the 20th century, Treblinka began to occupy a difficult but essential role. It forced historians, teachers, and students to confront a form of genocide stripped of complexity. There were no long-term prisoners, no work details meant to sustain life, no illusion of permanence. Treblinka existed for one purpose only, and it fulfilled that purpose with terrifying efficiency. Educators faced a challenge. How do you teach about a place that was designed to leave nothing behind? The answer, slowly, became testimony. Survivor accounts became the foundation of Treblinka's modern understanding. Men and women who had escaped the camp, who had survived the uprising, or who had been deported to other camps before Treblinka's destruction, carried memories that were fragile and incomplete, yet consistent in their core truths. Their words described sounds, smells, routines, and moments that could not be found in official documents. Through them, Treblinka regained dimension. Education programs began to emphasize lived experience rather than statistics alone. Students learned not only how many were murdered, but how victims arrived, what they saw, how they were deceived, and how quickly life ended. This approach did not sensationalize violence. It humanized it. It returned individuality to those the Nazis had reduced to numbers. Treblinka also reshaped how genocide itself was taught. Unlike concentration camps that evolved over time, Treblinka demonstrated how a state could design a system for mass murder from the outset. It showed that genocide could be planned as an industrial process, complete with schedules, supply chains, and administrative oversight. This understanding influenced genocide studies, human rights law, and international efforts to identify early warning signs of mass violence. Treblinka became a case study not only of what happened, but of how it happened. In Poland, the memorial site became a place of national reckoning. For a country that had lost millions of its citizens and endured occupation, Treblinka stood as a reminder of the consequences of hatred, collaboration, and silence. Polish educators worked alongside Jewish organizations to ensure that the camp's history was presented accurately and respectfully, acknowledging both the crimes committed and the complex realities of wartime Europe. Internationally, Treblinka entered museums, curricula, and commemorations. Its name appeared alongside Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Belzec as part of Operation Reinhard, the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. Yet Treblinka remained distinct, often described as the most lethal extermination site per day of operation. This distinction carried weight. IT challenged comfortable narratives that framed genocide as slow or inevitable. Treblinka proved that annihilation could occur rapidly once barriers were removed and humanity was stripped away. This lesson resonated beyond Holocaust studies, informing discussions about Rwanda, Cambodia, and other genocides of the modern era. For descendants of victims, Treblinka became both a wound and a place of connection. Many families had no graves to visit, no belongings to recover, no final letters to read. The memorial stones stood in place of headstones, offering a physical location where mourning could occur. Names etched into stone reclaimed identities that had been erased in smoke. Commemorative ceremonies held at Treblinka often emphasized silence. There were no grand speeches, no political declarations. Instead, participants walked the grounds, placed stones, recited prayers, or simply stood. This quiet approach reflected the camp's history. Treblinka did not need explanation. Its meaning was carried in the space itself. At the same time, debates emerge about representation. Some questioned whether Treblinka could ever be adequately conveyed without reconstructing buildings or creating immersive exhibits. Others argued that reconstruction risked distortion, turning genocide into spectacle. The decision to preserve Treblinka as an abstract memorial rather than a reconstructed site reflected a commitment to restraint and respect. Absence became the message that in the digital age, Treblinka's story reached new audiences. Online archives, virtual exhibits, and recorded testimonies allowed people across the world to engage with the camp's history without physically visiting. This accessibility expanded awareness, but also introduced new responsibilities. Context, accuracy, and sensitivity became crucial as information spread rapidly and widely. Educators emphasized critical thinking, encouraging learners to understand sources, recognize denial tactics, and differentiate between documentation and distortion. Treblinka, once hidden by design, became a focal point in the fight against historical erasure. The camp's legacy also influenced how societies remembered victims without survivors. Many who died at Treblinka left no witnesses to speak for them. In response, historians adopted methods that centered on transport lists, community records, and demographic studies to reconstruct lives that had been cut short. Each recovered name represented resistance against anonymity. Treblinka taught the world that memory does not depend on ruins. It depends on commitment to listening. to teaching, to refusing simplification, to honoring victims not as symbols, but as people who lived full lives before they were taken to AS, we move forward in this documentary. The focus will shift toward the present and the future. We will examine how Treblinka's history is used today, how it shaped conversations about human rights and responsibility, and why remembering this place remains essential in a world where hatred and division continue to find new forms. Treblinka is not only a chapter in history. It is a question posed to every generation. What will you do with the knowledge you inherit? Chapter 8, Segment 2. Memory under threat, denial, distortion, and the fight to preserve truth. As the decades passed and the generation of direct witnesses began to fade, Treblinka entered a new and dangerous phase of its history. The physical camp had already been destroyed by the Nazis. Now, the truth of what happened there faced a quieter, more insidious threat: denial, distortion, and forgetting. Holocaust denial did not emerge suddenly. It crept in slowly, often disguised as skepticism, revisionism, or demands for impossible levels of proof. Treblinka, because it left so little physical evidence and so few survivors, became a primary target. Deniers claimed the camp was exaggerated, misrepresented, or even fabricated. They argued that the absence of intact gas chambers or standing barracks proved nothing had occurred. This argument relied on ignorance of how Treblinka was designed. The Nazis built the camp to erase itself. Bodies were burned. Ashes were scattered. Buildings were dismantled. Trees were planted. The lack of ruins was not evidence of innocence. It was evidence of intent. Historians had to explain, repeatedly, that Treblinka's emptiness was itself part of the crime. Counter-denial. Scholars assembled an overwhelming body of evidence. Survivor testimonies were compared across decades and continents, revealing striking consistency in detail. German documents, transport records, SS correspondence, and post-war trial transcripts filled in administrative gaps. Aerial photographs confirmed camp layouts. Forensic archaeology uncovered mass graves beneath the soil. Truth did not rely on one source. It rested on convergence. Yet denial persisted, often amplified by political agendas or anti-Semitism. In some cases, Treblinka was minimized by comparisons that ranked suffering or questioned victim numbers. In others, it was used cynically in debates unrelated to history, stripping the camp of its meaning and reducing it to rhetoric. This distortion caused real harm. For survivors and descendants, denial reopened wounds. It transformed loss into something that had to be defended rather than mourned. Survivors were forced to prove their trauma to strangers who had never experienced war, hunger, or fear. Many chose silence rather than reliving their memories in hostile environments. Institutions responded by strengthening education and legal protections. Several European countries criminalized Holocaust denial, recognizing it not as free inquiry, but as a continuation of genocidal ideology. Museums expanded programming that addressed denial directly, teaching how false narratives are constructed and why they persist. Treblinka became central to these efforts because it represented genocide at its most absolute. Defending Treblinka's history meant defending the reality of the Holocaust itself. If Treblinka could be erased from memory, then the concept of industrialized murder could be weakened, relativized, or dismissed. Education adapted. Rather than focusing only on outcomes, educators emphasized process. Students learned how Treblinka was planned, staffed, and operated. They examined bureaucratic language that disguised murder. They studied the psychology of obedience, cruelty, and moral disengagement. Understanding how genocide worked made denial harder to sustain. Technology played a growing role. Digital mapping recreated the camp using survivor descriptions and archaeological data. Testimonies were recorded in high-definition video, preserving voices and expressions for future generations. Artificial intelligence tools began organizing archives, linking documents, and cross-referencing names to reconstruct lost communities. At the same time, technology introduced new risks. Misinformation spread faster than ever. Social media platforms allowed denialist content to reach global audiences instantly. Images were manipulated. Quotes were taken out of context. The fight for historical truth became constant and exhausting. Memory required active defense. Treblinka also forced difficult conversations about representation. How do you show a place that no longer exists? How do you teach horror without overwhelming or desensitizing? How do you honor victims without turning suffering into spectacle? Many educators adopted a principle of restraint. They avoided graphic imagery. They focused on personal stories, diaries, and letters written before deportation. They emphasized choices, resistance, and human dignity alongside suffering. Treblinka was not presented as a horror attraction, but as a moral boundary. This approach influenced global remembrance practices. Commemorations shifted from large ceremonies to intimate acts of memory. Reading names, lighting candles, walking silently. These rituals resisted the abstraction that denial thrives on. They restored individuality in the face of mass murder. The struggle over Treblinka's memory also highlighted the role of responsibility. Genocide did not happen in isolation. It required participation, silence, and compliance. Teaching Treblinka meant confronting uncomfortable truths about neighbors who benefited, institutions that failed, and systems that prioritized efficiency over humanity. This complexity challenged simplistic narratives of good and evil that IT also offered warning. Treblinka showed how quickly dehumanization can escalate when combined with power, ideology, and bureaucracy. The camp was not the result of ancient hatred alone. It was the product of modern systems used without ethical restraint. As the last survivors passed away, their testimonies became inheritances rather than conversations. The obligation to remember shifted fully to those who had not lived through the events. This transfer carried weight. Memory was no longer personal. It became collective. Treblinka's survival in history now depended on education, scholarship, and moral courage. The fight against denial is not only about the past. It is about the present and future. When truth is undermined, violence becomes easier to justify. When memory fades, repetition becomes possible. Treblinka stands as a test, not of what happened, that is known, but of whether humanity will choose to remember, protect truth, and act when warning signs appear again. In the next segment, we will turn toward the living legacy of Treblinka, how its lessons shape modern human rights law, genocide prevention efforts, and the global promise of never again, a promise that remains unfinished. Chapter 8, Segment 3, From Ashes to Obligation, how Treblinka shapes the modern world. Treblinka no longer exists as it once did, but its presence is not confined to the past. Long after the last transport arrived and the last fire burned, the consequences of Treblinka continued to shape law, ethics, education, and the global understanding of human rights. What happened there forced the world to confront a reality it had never fully faced before, that modern societies, using modern systems, could commit genocide on an industrial scale. In the years immediately following the war, Treblinka influenced the language of justice itself. During the Nuremberg trials and later proceedings in Germany, Poland, and Israel, prosecutors struggled to describe crimes that exceeded existing legal categories. Murder was too small a word. War crimes were insufficient. What had occurred at Treblinka was not collateral damage or battlefield excess. It was the deliberate destruction of a people. From this realization emerged the legal concept of genocide. Coined by legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, the term genocide was shaped directly by camps like Treblinka. Lemkin argued that the destruction of a group, not only through killing, but through the erasure of culture, family, and identity, constituted a unique crime under international law. His work led to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. Treblinka was written into the DNA of that convention, even when not named. The camp also influenced the creation of modern human rights frameworks. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in the same period, reflected lessons learned from the Holocaust. That states could not be trusted to protect their own citizens without accountability, and that dignity, life, and freedom must be recognized as universal, not conditional. Yet the promise embedded in these documents remained fragile. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, genocides occurred again in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere. Each time, Treblinka was invoked as a warning ignored. The phrase "never again" echoed repeatedly, but action often arrived too late or not at all. Treblinka thus became both a moral foundation and a measure of failure. Education became one of the primary defenses against repetition. Treblinka entered school curricula, museums, and universities across the world. It was taught not only as a historical site, but as a case study in how ordinary systems, railways, bureaucracy, language, obedience, can be transformed into tools of mass murder. Students were encouraged to ask how it happened, not only why. This shift mattered. Understanding Treblinka as a process rather than an anomaly made it relevant beyond its time and place. It showed that genocide does not begin with gas chambers. It begins with exclusion, propaganda, and the normalization of cruelty. Treblinka was the end point, not the beginning. Survivor testimony played a central role in this educational mission. Those who escaped Treblinka carried knowledge that no document could replace. Their words described the rhythm of daily death, the sounds, the smells, the silence after transports ended. As survivors aged, institutions raced to preserve these testimonies, recognizing that memory was finite. Video archives, written memoirs, and oral history projects ensured that Treblinka would continue to be described in human voices, not abstract summaries. These testimonies resisted the flattening effect of time. They reminded future generations that the victims were not statistics, but individuals with names, dreams, and families that at the same time. Remembrance raised difficult ethical questions. How do you memorialize a place designed solely for death? How do you avoid turning suffering into spectacle? How do you honor victims without exploiting their pain? Treblinka forced memorial designers, educators, and historians to confront these challenges directly. The solution was restraint. Unlike other sites, Treblinka's memorial avoided reconstruction. There are no recreated barracks or staged exhibits. Instead, the site is marked by stones, one for each destroyed Jewish community. Visitors walk through silence. The absence speaks louder than any display. This approach became a model that emphasized reflection over consumption, presence over explanation, memory over narrative control. Treblinka was not something to be experienced. It was something to be carried. The camp also influenced how societies think about complicity. Treblinka was not operated by a handful of monsters acting alone. It relied on guards, administrators, engineers, suppliers, and officials across Europe. It relied on neighbors who looked away, on institutions that cooperated, on systems that prioritized order over conscience. Teaching Treblinka meant teaching responsibility. This lesson became central to discussions of ethics in government, military training, and civil service. The camp demonstrated what happens when obedience replaces judgment and when legality is mistaken for morality. In the modern world, Treblinka is often invoked in conversations about warning signs, dehumanizing language, forced segregation, targeting of minorities, expansion of unchecked state power. While no situation is identical, Treblinka provides a reference point, a reminder of how quickly societies can descend when fear and ideology override empathy. The legacy of Treblinka is therefore unfinished that it lives in law, but law alone is insufficient. It lives in education, but education requires vigilance. It lives in memory, but memory fades without care. Treblinka demands more than remembrance. It demands responsibility. Responsibility to speak when silence becomes dangerous. Responsibility to challenge dehumanization wherever it appears. Responsibility to protect truth when denial resurfaces. Treblinka does not ask for grief alone. It asks for action that in the final chapters of this documentary, we will return to the question that has followed Treblinka since the war ended. What does it truly mean to say never again? And how close or how far humanity remains from honoring that promise? Chapter 9, Segment 1, Denial, Distortion, and the Battle for Historical Truth. As the physical traces of Treblinka were erased, another struggle began almost immediately. A struggle not over land or ruins, but over memory itself. Long before the camp was widely known to the world, forces were already at work attempting to minimize, distort, or deny what had happened there. This battle over truth would become one of the most enduring legacies of Treblinka, extending far beyond the war and into the present day. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, much of Europe was focused on survival and reconstruction. Cities lay in ruins, populations were displaced, and governments were fragile. In this environment, the crimes of extermination camps like Treblinka were not always confronted directly. For many, the scale of what had occurred was too vast to absorb. For others, acknowledging it meant facing uncomfortable questions about collaboration, indifference, or complicity. This silence created space for distortion. Unlike Auschwitz, Treblinka left behind almost no physical structures. The Nazis had dismantled the camp with the specific intention of erasing evidence. When survivors spoke of gas chambers, mass graves, and hundreds of thousands murdered, skeptics asked where the proof was. The absence of buildings became a weapon against truth. Denial did not always begin with outright rejection. Often it started with doubt. Questions were raised about numbers, about locations, about intent. Some claimed Treblinka was merely a labor camp. Others argued that deaths were exaggerated or the result of disease rather than systematic murder. These narratives were not born of honest confusion. They were deliberate attempts to weaken the historical record. Holocaust denial, as it came to be known, targeted Treblinka precisely because of its invisibility. Deniers exploited the lack of ruins and the relative scarcity of photographs. They ignored testimonies. They dismissed forensic investigations. They reframed survivor accounts as unreliable or fabricated. In doing so, they attempted not only to erase the victims, but to discredit those who lived to speak for them. This denial caused real harm. For survivors, it reopened wounds that had never healed. To have one's suffering questioned, to be told that what you saw, smelled, and endured did not happen, was a second violation. Many survivors described denial as more painful than silence, because it attacked their very reality In response, historians, archivists, and investigators intensified their efforts. Documents were gathered from German archives. Transport records were cross-referenced. SS correspondence was analyzed. Aerial photographs were studied. Soil samples were examined. Even in the absence of standing buildings, the ground itself told a story. Ash layers, bone fragments, and disturbed earth confirmed what witnesses had said all along. Treblinka became one of the most thoroughly documented extermination sites in history. Not despite denial, but because of it, survivor testimonies were recorded with urgency. Courts took sworn statements. Scholars compared accounts independently given by people who had never met, only to find striking consistency in detail. The same layouts, the same routines, the same horrors described from different perspectives. The truth proved resilient, yet denial did not disappear. It adapted. In later decades, denial moved into coded language. Some no longer denied that Jews died, but questioned intent. Others acknowledged killing, but rejected the term genocide. Still others attempted to shift blame entirely, framing the Holocaust as an unfortunate byproduct of war rather than a planned campaign of extermination. Treblinka remained central to these arguments because it stripped away ambiguity. There was no pretense of resettlement, no large labor force, no economic justification. Treblinka existed for one reason only. Its very simplicity, arrival, selection, death, exposed the core of Nazi intent. That clarity made it dangerous to those who sought to rewrite history. AS denial spread into pamphlets, books, and eventually the internet. Governments and institutions were forced to respond. Laws against Holocaust denial were enacted in several countries. Educational programs were expanded. Museums dedicated entire sections to countering misinformation. Still, the challenge persisted. In the digital age, denial found new audiences. False narratives spread rapidly, often disguised as revisionism or alternative history. Algorithms amplified controversy. The distance of time made younger generations more vulnerable to doubt. This is why Treblinka matters now as much as ever, not as a symbol frozen in the past, but as a reference point for truth in an era of distortion. Treblinka teaches that facts require defense, that memory must be protected actively, that silence and skepticism can be as dangerous as lies. The struggle over Treblinka is not only about honoring victims. It is about preserving the integrity of history itself. When truth is undermined, atrocity becomes repeatable. In the next segment, we will examine how Treblinka has been represented and misrepresented in culture, media, and public discourse, and how the responsibility of remembrance has shifted from survivors to the generations who must now carry their voices forward. Chapter 9, Segment 2, Memory Without Witnesses. How Treblinka is remembered after the survivors. As the decades passed and survivors of Treblinka aged, a quiet but profound transition began to take place. The responsibility of memory, once carried by those who had seen the camp with their own eyes, slowly shifted to people who had never stood on that ground, never smelled the smoke, never heard the screams. This transition marked one of the most fragile moments in Treblinka's history, because memory without living witnesses depends entirely on choice. For many years after the war, survivors were the primary defense against forgetting. They spoke in courtrooms, classrooms, and recorded interviews. Their presence alone carried weight. When a survivor described Treblinka, there was no abstraction. There was a human being standing in front of you, bearing the physical and emotional scars of what had occurred. Their testimony demanded belief, but time, as it always does, moved forward. By the late 20th century, many Treblinka survivors had passed away. Others were no longer able to speak publicly. The generation that had lived through the camp began to fade, leaving behind recorded voices, written memoirs, and fading photographs. For the first time, Treblinka existed almost entirely as history rather than lived memory. This change altered how the camp was understood. Without direct witnesses, Treblinka risked becoming distant. Reduced to numbers. Reduced to timelines. Reduced to a paragraph in a textbook. The danger was not denial alone, but indifference. When atrocity becomes abstract, it loses urgency. It becomes easier to turn away. Recognizing this risk, historians and memorial institutions took deliberate action. Treblinka's memorial site was redesigned not to overwhelm with structures, but to confront visitors with absence. Instead of reconstructed buildings, the site emphasizes emptiness. Stones mark the locations of gas chambers. Paths trace the routes victims once walked. Names of destroyed Jewish communities are etched into monuments, transforming geography into testimony. This design choice was intentional. Treblinka is not meant to feel explanatory. It is meant to feel incomplete. Visitors are meant to sense what is missing, not what remains. The silence is part of the story. It mirrors the silence the Nazis attempted to impose on history. Education became central to preservation. School programs across Europe and beyond incorporated Treblinka in a Holocaust curricula. Students were taught not only what happened, but how the camp functioned within the broader machinery of genocide. Lessons focused on choices. Choices made by perpetrators, bystanders, and victims. This approach emphasized that Treblinka was not inevitable. It was built by decisions. Museums expanded their use of survivor recordings. Interactive exhibits allowed visitors to hear voices describing arrival, selections, labor, resistance, and escape. These recordings preserved not just facts, but tone, hesitation, emotion. They restored individuality to a place designed to erase it. Even after death, survivors continued to speak at the same time. Treblinka entered literature, film, and art. Some works were careful and respectful. Others were controversial. Fictionalized portrayals raised difficult questions about representation. How much could be imagined? What should remain sacred? Where is the line between education and exploitation? These debates were not academic. They reflected a deeper anxiety about how future generations would connect emotionally to Treblinka. Facts alone were not enough. Memory required engagement. But engagement carried risk. Oversimplification, sensationalism, distortion. The responsibility became heavier with each passing year. By the early 21st century, a generation had emerged for whom the Holocaust was already distant history. For them, Treblinka existed alongside ancient empires and medieval wars, tragic but far removed. Educators and historians faced a new challenge: how to make Treblinka feel real without living witnesses. The answer increasingly lay in ethical storytelling. Rather than dramatizing violence, educators focused on daily life. Hunger, fear, small acts of kindness, letters written in secret, songs remembered from home. These details humanized the victims without reducing them to suffering alone. They reminded audiences that those murdered at Treblinka were not symbols. They were people with futures that were stolen. Technology played a role as well. Digital archives made documents accessible worldwide. Virtual tours allowed people to walk the site remotely. Databases recorded names of victims and survivors, restoring identity where the Nazis had imposed anonymity. For families searching for lost relatives, Treblinka became searchable, traceable, named. Yet technology also introduced new risks. Online spaces allowed misinformation to spread faster than ever before. Denial and distortion reached audiences with little historical context. The absence of survivors made it harder to counter emotionally persuasive falsehoods. Memory required not only preservation, but vigilance. This is where moral responsibility enters. Remembering Treblinka is not a passive act. It requires choice. It requires effort. It requires confronting discomfort. The camp challenges comforting narratives about progress, civilization, and human nature. It forces questions that have no easy answers. What happens when bureaucracy becomes lethal? What happens when obedience replaces conscience? What happens when entire populations are reduced to problems to AS survivors disappear? These questions become the inheritance of those who never experienced the camp directly. Memory becomes an obligation rather than a recollection. Treblinka now exists in a fragile balance, preserved through records, stones, voices, and education. Threatened by time, indifference, and distortion. Its future depends not on survivors, but on whether societies choose to listen to the echoes they left behind. In the final segment of this chapter, we will examine how Treblinka's legacy continues to shape global conversations about genocide, human rights, and the warning signs that history leaves behind, if we are willing to recognize them. Chapter 9, Segment 3. The warnings Treblinka left behind. What the camp still tells the world. Treblinka was designed to leave no trace, no witnesses, no future memory. Yet despite the Nazis' efforts, the camp now stands as one of the clearest warnings in human history, not only about what happened, but about how easily it happened. As time moves further away from the Holocaust, Treblinka's most important role is no longer forensic. It is moral. The camp reveals how genocide does not begin with gas chambers, that it begins with language. Before Treblinka was built, Jews were described as problems, burdens, threats, and contaminants. Bureaucratic language replaced human language. Deportations were framed as resettlement. Murder was reframed as processing. These shifts did not occur overnight. They happened gradually, normalized through repetition, paperwork, and authority. Treblinka shows what happens when words lose their connection to humanity. The camp also exposes the danger of efficiency divorced from ethics. Treblinka was not chaotic. It was organized, timetabled, optimized. Trains arrived on schedule. Victims were processed with industrial precision. Murder was measured in capacity, throughput, and output. The camp represents the terrifying potential of modern systems when morality is removed from decision-making. This is one of Treblinka's most unsettling lessons. Evil does not require madness. IT does not require chaos. That IT can thrive inside order. Another warning lies in obedience. Most of those who operated Treblinka were not high-ranking ideologues. They were clerks, guards, engineers, and administrators. Many claimed, after the war, that they were following orders, that refusal was impossible, that responsibility lay elsewhere. Treblinka demonstrates how diffusion of responsibility allows atrocities to function. When no one feels personally responsible, everyone becomes complicit. Treblinka also forces confrontation with silence. The camp operated for over a year, killing hundreds of thousands, while much of the surrounding world knew little or chose not to know. Information existed. Reports circulated. Refugees spoke. Yet action was limited, delayed, or absent. Treblinka reminds us that ignorance is not always accidental. Sometimes it is convenient. Silence can be as lethal as violence. The legacy of Treblinka, therefore, extends far beyond World War I. IT informs modern discussions about ethnic cleansing, mass detention, and state-sponsored violence. When populations are isolated, stripped of rights, and dehumanized, Treblinka's shadow appears. The camp stands as proof that genocide is not an ancient phenomenon. It is a recurring risk. Treblinka also reshapes how justice is understood. Many perpetrators were never punished. Many victims were never identified. Traditional justice was incomplete. This reality forces a broader understanding of accountability, one that includes memory, education, and prevention. Remembering Treblinka is not about closure. It is about responsibility. For descendants of victims, Treblinka remains a wound without a grave. There are no headstones for most who died there. No final resting places. Memory becomes the only form of mourning. Names spoken aloud become acts of resistance against erasure. Every retelling restores a fragment of what was taken. For the world, Treblinka is a mirror. It reflects what societies are capable of under certain conditions. It challenges comforting myths about moral immunity. No nation, culture, or era is automatically protected from repeating similar crimes. The mechanisms that created Treblinka, fear, propaganda, obedience, dehumanization, are not confined to the past. They reappear whenever power goes unchecked. This is why Treblinka must remain uncomfortable. IT must not become ceremonial. It must not become distant. It must resist simplification. Its role is not to reassure us that we are better now, but to ask whether we are vigilant enough to prevent repetition. Education about Treblinka is therefore not optional. IT is a form of early warning. It trains recognition. It teaches how small choices accumulate into irreversible outcomes. It reminds us that genocide is not a sudden collapse into darkness, but a gradual narrowing of empathy. As the last survivors fade from living memory, Treblinka's warning grows louder, not quieter. The camp speaks through absence, through silence, through what should never have existed. It demands attention not because it is unique, but because it is possible. In the next chapter, we will move beyond remembrance and examine how Treblinka has shaped international law, genocide prevention frameworks, and the global commitment, fragile and imperfect, to the promise of never again. Chapter 10, Segment 1. After Treblinka, justice, law, and the struggle to prevent genocide. When Treblinka ceased to exist physically, its consequences did not. The camp's destruction did not end its impact on the world. Instead, Treblinka entered a second life, not as a place, but as a reference point for how modern societies understand genocide, justice, and responsibility. In the years immediately following World War II, the world struggled to comprehend crimes on a scale that Treblinka represented. There was no legal language sufficient to describe what had occurred. Existing laws of war addressed battlefield conduct, not industrialized murder of civilians. Treblinka exposed a legal void as vast as its moral one. That this void forced the world to respond. The Nuremberg trials were the first attempt to create accountability for crimes like Treblinka. For the first time, individuals were prosecuted not only for violating national laws, but for crimes against humanity. The concept itself was revolutionary. It acknowledged that certain acts are crimes regardless of where they occur or who orders them. Yet even at Nuremberg, Treblinka remained only partially addressed. Many of the camp's direct perpetrators were dead, had escaped, or were never identified. Commandants like Franz Stangl would eventually face justice years later, but countless others lived out ordinary lives. The trials revealed an uncomfortable truth. Legal systems, no matter how determined, struggle to keep pace with mass atrocity. Justice after genocide is always incomplete. Still, Treblinka helped shape new legal frameworks. The horrors of extermination camps directly influenced the drafting of the Genocide Convention in 1948. For the first time, genocide was defined as a distinct crime under international law. The convention recognized that the destruction of a group, not only through killing, but through starvation, displacement, and cultural erasure, constituted one of humanity's gravest offenses that Treblinka's existence made denial impossible. The camp also influenced the creation of international human rights law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerged from the same historical reckoning. Its principles, dignity, equality, the right to life, were articulated in direct response to places like Treblinka, where every one of those principles had been systematically destroyed. But law alone could not guarantee prevention. Treblinka demonstrated that genocide does not occur in a legal vacuum. It happens within functioning states with bureaucracies, paperwork, and public compliance. Laws can exist while atrocities continue. This realization led to the development of early warning systems, genocide studies, and international monitoring bodies. The challenge became prediction, not just punishment. Scholars began analyzing Treblinka not only as a historical event, but as a process. What conditions made it possible? How ideology became policy? How ordinary institutions became tools of annihilation? These studies reshaped how future atrocities in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere would be interpreted. Each time, Treblinka's lessons resurfaced. Another consequence of Treblinka was the evolving concept of individual responsibility. The defense of just following orders lost legitimacy after the Holocaust. Treblinka showed how obedience, when unexamined, becomes lethal. This understanding influenced military codes, civil service ethics, and international law. Individuals could no longer claim moral neutrality in systems of violence. Yet this principle remains contested. Treblinka also transformed how memory itself is treated as a form of justice. Because so many victims had no graves, no names, and no records, remembrance became an obligation. Museums, memorials, and educational institutions emerged not as symbols, but as safeguards. Memory was reframed as prevention. Forgetting, by contrast, became dangerous. This is why Treblinka's story is taught across generations, not to traumatize, but to inoculate. The camp's influence extended into journalism and historical research. Standards for documenting mass atrocities were reshaped. Survivor testimony gained recognition as historical evidence. Silence was no longer acceptable. Documentation became a moral act. Treblinka forced the world to understand that denial is a continuation of violence. At the same time, Treblinka exposed the limits of international will. Despite the phrase, never again, genocides continued after World War II. Each time, the world responded with hesitation, debate, and delay. Treblinka stands as a reminder that recognition does not guarantee intervention. Knowledge does not ensure action. This tension defines the post-Treblinka world. The camp's legacy therefore exists in contradiction that it inspired unprecedented legal and moral frameworks, yet it also revealed how fragile those frameworks remain. It led to global commitments, yet those commitments are repeatedly tested. Treblinka taught humanity what genocide looks like and how easily it can return as the world moved forward. Treblinka became a reference point not only for historians, but for policymakers, educators, and activists. Its name is invoked whenever early signs of mass violence appear. It serves as a warning flare from the past, not because history repeats itself identically, but because human behavior often does that. In the final segments of this documentary, we will turn inward, examining memory, denial, education, and the responsibility carried by future generations. Treblinka's story does not end with law or liberation. It continues wherever choices are made about who belongs, who is protected, and who is erased. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Memory, Denial, and the fight against erasure. After the war, Treblinka faced a second kind of destruction, not physical, but historical. The Nazis had already tried to erase the camp itself, leveling buildings and planting trees to conceal what had happened. What followed was an even longer struggle, preserving truth in the face of denial, distortion, and forgetting. Unlike Auschwitz, Treblinka left behind almost no structures. There are no intact barracks, no standing gas chambers, no visible remnants of daily life. This absence made denial easier. With little physical evidence remaining, skeptics and ideologues attempted to minimize or outright deny what occurred there. But Treblinka's story did not rely on ruins alone. Survivor testimony became the foundation of memory. The voices of those who escaped, few as they were, carried details no document could fully capture. They described the arrival platforms, the forced undressing, the path to the gas chambers, the screams, the smells, and the silence afterward. These testimonies were recorded, cross-referenced, and preserved, forming an irreplaceable historical record. Memory became evidence at the same time. Historians pieced together Treblinka's operation through German documents, transport records, and post-war trials. Even the fragments left behind told a story. Schedules of deportation trains, construction invoices, correspondence between SS officials, the bureaucracy of death preserved in paper. Together, testimony and documentation formed an unbroken chain of truth, yet denial persisted. Some denied the scale. Others denied intent. Others denied the existence of gas chambers altogether. Treblinka became a focal point in these arguments precisely because it was designed to leave so little behind. Denial was not born of ignorance alone. It was often ideological, anti-Semitic, or political, a refusal to accept the moral implications of the past. Responding to denial required more than rebuttal. It required education. In the decades after the war, Treblinka was incorporated into school curricula, university courses, and public exhibitions, not as a distant tragedy, but as a case study in how genocide functions. Students learned not only what happened, but how it happened, step by step, policy by policy. This educational focus shifted attention from perpetrators alone to systems. Treblinka demonstrated that genocide is rarely sudden. It emerges through language, dehumanization, normalization, and gradual escalation. Teaching Treblinka became a way to teach vigilance, how early warning signs appear long before mass murder begins. The memorial at Treblinka reflects this purpose. Instead of reconstructing buildings, the site was designed as a symbolic landscape. Stones bearing the names of destroyed Jewish communities stand where people once arrived. A shattered monument marks the area of the gas chambers. The emptiness itself speaks. Visitors are confronted not with spectacle, but with absence. This design forces reflection. There is no reenactment. No dramatization. Only the quiet realization that nearly 1 million lives ended here, leaving little behind but memory. The memorial resists voyeurism. It insists on respect. Memory, however, is fragile as generations pass. Living witnesses become fewer. The responsibility of remembrance shifts from those who experience Treblinka to those who study it. This transition raises urgent questions. How do we preserve authenticity without first-hand voices? How do we teach empathy without direct testimony? Technology has become one answer. Recorded testimonies, digitized archives, and interactive educational tools now preserve survivor voices for future generations. Museums and research institutions continue to collect and analyze new evidence, ensuring that Treblinka remains present in historical consciousness. But technology alone is not enough. memory also depends on moral commitment. Treblinka challenges each generation to decide whether history will be confronted or ignored, whether denial will be challenged or allowed to spread, whether the victims will be remembered as individuals, not numbers. This struggle is ongoing that in some places Holocaust education faces resistance. Political pressures, misinformation, and cultural fatigue threaten to reduce Treblinka to a footnote. Each time this happens, the risk of repetition increases. Forgetting does not erase the past. It erodes the safeguards against its return. Treblinka teaches that memory is not passive. It must be actively defended. The camp's legacy is therefore not confined to museums or textbooks. It lives in public discourse, ethical debates, and the choices societies make when confronted with intolerance and dehumanization. Remembering Treblinka is not only about honoring victims. It is about recognizing warning signs in the present. Silence, Treblinka reminds us, is never neutral. The camp existed because too many people accepted exclusion, obeyed authority, or looked away. Memory challenges that behavior. It insists that individuals matter. That indifference has consequences that as this documentary approaches its conclusion. Treblinka stands not only as a historical site, but as a moral measure. How societies respond to its memory reveals how seriously they take the promise of never again. In the final segment, we will consider Treblinka's legacy in the present day, how its lessons continue to shape identity, responsibility, and the fragile boundary between civilization and collapse. Chapter 10, Segment 3: Legacy, Responsibility, and the Meaning of Never Again. Treblinka no longer exists as a functioning place. Its buildings are gone. Its machinery was dismantled. Its perpetrators are mostly dead. And yet, Treblinka is not finished with history. Its presence remains, not in structures, but in responsibility. The legacy of Treblinka is not only about what happened there. It is about what humanity chooses to do with that knowledge. For decades after the war, Treblinka occupied an uneasy space in public memory. Auschwitz became the primary symbol of the Holocaust, while Treblinka, where nearly as many were murdered, remained less visible. This imbalance was not intentional, but it had consequences. When history becomes simplified, some truths fade faster than others. Treblinka's legacy demands correction of that silence. Unlike camps that combine labor and murder, Treblinka was designed for one purpose alone. It represents the most distilled form of genocide, an industrial process with no economic justification, no strategic goal beyond annihilation. This makes Treblinka uniquely important to understanding how far ideology can push human systems. It answers a disturbing question. What happens when bureaucracy, technology, and obedience are aligned with hate? The answer lies in the ashes beneath the soil. Today, Treblinka is visited by students, researchers, descendants of victims, and people who arrive with no personal connection at all. Many leave changed, not because they saw something shocking, but because they saw almost nothing. The absence forces imagination, and imagination, guided by truth, can be more powerful than spectacle. Standing at Treblinka, visitors confront a reality that words struggle to contain. That millions of lives were erased, not in chaos, but in order. That human beings were processed like cargo. That neighbors disappeared and the world continued. This confrontation creates responsibility. Responsibility does not mean inherited guilt. It means inherited awareness. Treblinka does not accuse future generations. It warns them. It asks whether systems today still allow dehumanization to grow quietly, whether language still reduces people to categories. Whether obedience still outweighs conscience. The phrase "never again" is often repeated. But Treblinka reveals how fragile that promise is. Never again is not a conclusion. It is a task that IT requires vigilance against hatred in all forms, not only its most extreme expressions. It requires defending historical truth when it is challenged or distorted. It requires recognizing that genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with exclusion, propaganda, and silence. Treblinka also reshapes how we understand resistance. Resistance that did not look like victory. It did not save the camp, but it preserved dignity. The uprising proved that even in conditions designed to erase humanity, choice remained. The prisoners who resisted did not act because they believed they would survive. They acted because survival without dignity was no longer acceptable. That lesson endures. Resistance today may look different. It may take the form of education, testimony, documentation, and remembrance. It may involve confronting denial, challenging prejudice, or defending vulnerable communities. But its foundation is the same: refusal to accept injustice as normal. Treblinka also reminds us that remembrance must be inclusive. The victims were not only Jews from Poland, but from across Europe. Entire communities vanished. Languages, traditions, and families erased within months. Remembering Treblinka means remembering those communities as they lived, not only how they died. IT means restoring names where numbers were imposed. Museums, archives, and memorial projects continue this work. They collect photographs, letters, and stories, fragments that rebuild human presence from destruction. Each recovered name is an act of defiance against the Nazi goal of total erasure. But remembrance is not limited to institutions. That IT lives in classrooms where difficult questions are asked, in conversations that refuse simplification, in documentaries like this one, created not to shock, but to preserve truth. Each retelling is a safeguard against forgetting. That Treblinka's final legacy is therefore not despair. IT is warning paired with responsibility. The camp shows the consequences of unchecked hatred, but it also shows the power of memory to outlast destruction. The Nazis attempted to erase Treblinka completely. They failed. The ground remembers. History remembers. And as long as the story is told, humanity remembers. Treblinka stands as a boundary marker in human history. That on one side lies civilization, imperfect, fragile, but capable of compassion and restraint. On the other lies collapse, when people become categories and life becomes disposable. The distance between those sides is shorter than we like to believe. Treblinka teaches us how easily that boundary can be crossed, and why it must never be ignored again. As this documentary ends, the story of Treblinka does not. It continues in memory, in education, and in the choices made every day by people who understand what was lost and what must never be lost again. In memory of the victims of Treblinka, may their lives be remembered, their voices honored, and their absence never ignored. Treblinka was built to disappear. Its victims were meant to vanish without names, without graves, without memory. The Nazis believed that fire, ash, and silence would be enough to erase a crime of this scale. They were wrong. What remains today is not a camp, but a responsibility to remember those who were murdered not as numbers, but as people, children who never grew old, parents who tried to protect their families, communities that sang, prayed, argued, laughed, and lived, until they were erased in a single moment of history. Treblinka teaches us that genocide does not begin with gas chambers, that IT begins with words, with laws, with walls, with silence. And it teaches us that remembrance is not passive. IT is an act of resistance. Be while learning this history. By telling it carefully and truthfully, we deny hatred the secrecy it needs to grow. We ensure that the victims of Treblinka are not lost a second time. This time to forgetting as you leave this story tonight, carry their memory forward. Speak their names when you can. Challenge denial when you hear it. Protect truth when it is threatened. Because history does not repeat itself automatically, that IT repeats only when we allow it to fade. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. May the victims of Treblinka never be forgotten.